Welcome to Goofy Harry. Today's adventure. What if Saitama trained Harry for 3 years until one spell could destroy Voldemort in a single punch? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. 3 years, more or less the day Harry Potter turned 8 was by any reasonable measure a bad day. He woke to Vernon's voice through the cupboard slats, a sound that had the same shape as a closing door. The shape was familiar. He sat up, careful of the low ceiling that had been low for as long as he could remember. His hand hovered near a lump of cardboard wrapped in newspaper. The newspaper was last Sunday's. The cardboard had been the inside of a cereal box. He had cut it into the shape of a cake and drawn 8 candles on it with the green crayon stub from under the stairs. The candles were not lit on account of him being 8 and not, in any sense, on fire. He looked at his cake. He put it back. In the kitchen, Dudley was being 8.5 months for the 11th time that year. Aunt Petunia made pancakes shaped like the number 8, which was clever, and gave him a Game Boy, which was loud. Harry was given a list. The list said, weed the begonias, scrub the bin, wash Dudley's swimming trunks, wash Vernon's car, do not break anything, do not be ugly. He read it twice, this was good practice, and started on the begonias. By 11, the sun had stopped pretending and the begonias were a smaller, sadder version of themselves. Harry's hands were chewed up where stems had bitten back. There was a smudge of dirt on his glasses and a smudge of dirt on the inside of his glasses, which was difficult, and a smudge of dirt that had nothing to do with the begonias. Dudley's birthday party arrived. Dudley's friends arrived. They were the noise that comes when the wrong sort of boy turns 8. Too clean, too clever, too pleased. By 2, Harry was in the cupboard for a thing he had not done. He had been, technically, near the thing. The thing was a window. The window had been there for some time. By 1:30, the cupboard door had unbolted itself, which was the sort of thing Harry tried not to think about closely. Vernon's belt was on the doorknob, which meant the door was a different kind of door now. It is unhelpful to dwell on the cupboard. The cupboard was a small place. Small places are largely the same. What matters is what happened after, because what happened after was, Harry, head down on a bare mattress, very tired and very small, watched a wedge of darkness in the corner go very pale, and then very white, and then a thing that was not a color at all. A wall opened the way wet paper opens. He fell into it because he was leaning on it. There was a brief sensation of moving while not moving. The cupboard had taught him this one already, in different weather, and then the smell of fried egg. A man in a yellow tracksuit was looking at him. The man had a head the precise shape of a head and no hair on it whatsoever. His eyes were doing the thing eyes do when they are looking at a problem that is small enough to be solved by closing them again. In one hand he held a paper flyer. The flyer was creased. The flyer was, Harry would later learn, the most important thing in the room. Huh, said the man. He looked down at Harry. He looked at the wall, which was now a wall again, the kind that does not open. He looked at the flyer. You're not the delivery guy, he said. No, said Harry. You got egg on you, said the man. Harry looked down. There was egg on him. He was unsure how. He had not had eggs in some time. The man set the flyer on a low table with the care of a person who knew where his life was kept. He moved into a small kitchen that was the same room as the rest of the apartment, opened a fridge that hummed with the low, dignified hum of a fridge containing almost nothing, and produced a cup of tea. The tea was already in the cup, which struck Harry as efficient. Drink that, said the man. You look like a small wet bird. Harry drank. The tea was warm and the warmness moved through him at the pace warmth moves through someone who has been cold for a long time. I'm Saitama, said the man. He did not say it the way people on television say their names. He said it the way you tell someone the bus stop. Harry, said Harry. Yes, said the bald man who had been Saitama for one sentence and would, the universe permitting, be many other things by the time Harry needed to use the name a 6th time. He sat down on the floor across from Harry and folded his legs. He picked up the flyer. He stared at it. Eggs are on sale, he said, mostly to the flyer. Harry waited. You teleport, said the bald man without looking up. I don't know, said Harry. Magic. Harry thought about this. Sometimes things happen, he said, when I'm upset. Cool, said the bald man. A long silence followed. It was the wrong word for what it was because the silence was full of fridge, of street, of a faint mechanical thumping from one floor up, but it was the kind of silence that doesn't ask you for anything. Harry's hands were on the cup. The cup was warm. The cup was very warm. Can I stay, said Harry, who had not meant to say anything. The bald man considered the flyer. For tonight, he said. It was tonight for 3 years. In retrospect, Harry's retrospect, which is the only one we have access to here, since the bald man's retrospect lives in a brain that mostly thinks about discount fish, the first night was the deciding one. The bald man had a spare blanket. The spare blanket was the size of a kitchen towel. The bald man had a spare pillow. The spare pillow was a folded jumper. In the morning, the bald man cooked 2 eggs and ate one of them. He put the other on a plate in front of Harry. He looked at Harry. He looked at the floor between them, which was unremarkable. "You can stay," he said, "but if you're staying, you train. Train. Yeah, you're a kid with magic and you don't know what to do with it. That's how kids get killed. Train." "How?" The bald man closed his eyes a moment. He opened them. He spoke the way a person speaks who has said the same thing many times to himself in the bathroom mirror. 100 fireballs, 100 patronesses, 100 silent castings, 10 kilometers running every day for 3 years. Harry waited for the rest. There was no rest. "That's it," said Harry. "That's it." "What's a patroness?" The bald man frowned. "Don't know," he said. "Sounds like a happy ghost. Make one of those, 100 of them. And silent casting, don't talk, cast." Harry blinked twice, which was a habit he had not had yesterday. "And fireballs." "Fire," said the bald man. "Ball." Harry looked at his egg. The egg looked back in the unconcerned manner of an egg. "Okay," he said. Z-City, it turned out, was a city. It had streets and signs and a man on a corner shouting about a brand of soda. It had a sky that was sometimes blue and sometimes the color of an unwashed cup. It had grocery stores. The grocery stores were the chief feature of the bald man's geography. 3 weeks in, Harry drew a map of the neighborhood that contained 4 grocery stores and no roads. The apartment was on a 3rd floor above a noodle place where a woman with 1 earring shouted at her son in a language Harry did not understand but found comforting because it was not Vernon. Training began the next morning. It began the way important things begin, badly. Harry produced a fireball by aiming his hand at a wall and thinking very hard about being warm. The fireball was the size of a thumb. It was a sad orange color. It fell out of his palm and landed on the bald man's slipper. "Step 2, said the bald man, putting the slipper out with his other slipper. "Not on the slipper." Harry produced a patroness by thinking of his mother, which he could not really remember, and so by thinking of his father, which he could not really remember, and so in the end by thinking of the egg from yesterday. The patroness came out of the end of a kitchen chopstick, no wand yet, as a small silver smudge that paced once across the floor and went politely under the sofa. Harry crawled after it. He found a 50-yen coin. "Keep the coin," said the bald man. 100 more. A silent casting that first day was a sneeze with intent. Harry sneezed. A window pane 2 streets over chose to be in 2 places at once for a moment before deciding to be in only one. The bald man, who at that moment was squeezing a tomato, looked up. "Whoa," he said. He looked at the tomato. He looked at Harry. He went back to the tomato. Harry made 83 fireballs the first day, 57 not quite patronesses, and 21 silent castings, 2 of them sneezes, one of which boiled the kettle dry from across the room. He ran 6 kilometers around the block before his legs stopped working in the order he wanted. The bald man jogged behind him in slippers, without ever appearing to move at anything beyond a slow walk. "You'll get there, kid," he said when Harry sat on the curb in the long blue dusk and tried to breathe in the order his body remembered breathing in. "I'm tired," said Harry. "Yeah, I want to go home," said Harry, who was lying. He did not, in fact, want to go home. He was 8 and the cupboard had not yet receded from his shoulders. It seemed like a thing a normal child would say, and Harry had been collecting normal child things for some time. The bald man squinted at him. "Where's home?" Harry considered this question. He considered it for some time. He looked at the sky, which had gone the color of a peach that hadn't ripened. "Here," he said. "Yeah," said the bald man. "Thought so." He stood up, he stretched. He produced from somewhere a flyer that promised half-off cabbage. "Eat dinner," he said, "then sleep. Tomorrow's harder." It was harder for 1,095 days in a row without exception, and then it stopped being hard. Year 1 in summary, the fireballs got bigger. By month 4, Harry could produce a flame the size of his head. By month 6, the bald man asked him to make them smaller, because the kitchen ceiling was starting to look thoughtful. By month 9, Harry could call up a fire that fit in a teacup and stay there as long as he liked, the way a polite cat fits in a teacup and refuses to. Patronesses arrived properly in month 7. He had been at it for 4 hours, alone in a park where the trees did the slow looking around trees sometimes do when no one human is watching. He thought of nothing in particular: the egg, the chopstick, the woman downstairs and her son and her 1 earring, the way the bald man fell asleep with his mouth in an O and his hands, perfectly empty, threw out a thing. It came out 4-legged. It paced once around him. It had antlers it did not quite seem to need. It stood near his ankle for a length of time long enough that Harry, who had not been close to anything for a number of years, sat down and watched it. The patroness, for its part, regarded him with the careful neutrality of a creature recently arrived. "Hi," said Harry. The patroness did not say hi. Harry walked home alongside it. It paced him in slow, patient steps. Halfway up the stairs to the apartment, it dissolved gently as if to say it would be back when needed. Harry made dinner without speaking. The bald man watched him over a satsuma and chose, that night, to say nothing. Silent casting was the slowest. The bald man's instruction in totality was don't talk, cast. Harry, who had learned to read Vernon's silences the way other children read weather, found this unhelpful for some months and then helpful all at once. The trick discovered sitting cross-legged on the cool linoleum at 3 in the morning, watching the bald man sleep, was to think the spell and then not think anything else, including the question of whether the spell would work. Once he had unlearned the question, the spell came. It came reliably. It came at any size he asked for. The running, the less said about the running, the better. By the end of year 1, Harry could run 10 kilometers in the time it took the bald man to choose between 2 brands of tofu in a grocery aisle, which was, depending on the day, less time than it sounds. Year 2 arrived without ceremony. The bald man celebrated by not celebrating. He bought a discounted cake from the noodle place downstairs and ate 3/4 of it. Harry, presented with the remaining quarter, found that he liked cake very much. In the spring of year 2, the door buzzed. The bald man, who was watching a baseball game on a television that owed its life to several decades of stubbornness, did not look up. Harry, who had finished his second 100 fireballs and was sitting at the low table making the 4-legged thing trot in circles around a satsuma peel, went to the door. He opened it. A young man stood on the landing. He had cheekbones whose architecture suggested intention. His hair was the color of wet straw. His arms, and this would matter, were not in the strict sense arms. They were arms in the sense that a thing shaped like an arm is an arm. The joints did not bend like joints. They bent like things made by a person who had decided how the joint should bend. The hands at the ends were warm metal. Steam coiled from them in a way the laws of metal and air did not strictly require but seemed to enjoy. "Master," said the young man and bowed. Harry looked over his shoulder. The bald man waved at the television without looking around. "Genos," he said. "Master," said Genos, "I have come to resume my discipleship." The bald man mildly said, "Cool." Genos crossed the threshold and bowed, properly this time, to the kitchen. He turned to Harry. He inspected Harry. His eyes, a quiet gold, did the thing scanners do. "You are also a disciple," he said. "Yes," said Harry, who was not entirely sure of this. "Then you are my fellow disciple." "Okay," said Harry. "It is an honor." "Okay," said Harry. Genos bowed once more to Harry, this time, which Harry did not know how to receive. Genos, sensing this, did not require him to receive it. He took a seat at the low table with the seriousness of a person sitting for a portrait. He produced a small notebook. He wrote in it. "What are you writing?" said Harry. "Master's training program," said Genos. "I have not yet been told the details. I am, however, certain it will be transformative. It's 100 fireballs, 100 patronesses, 100 silent castings, and a 10-kilometer run every day." Genos wrote this down with the reverence of a man taking dictation from a god. He underlined fireballs, and no air conditioning, called the bald man from the couch. Genos underlined that too. Harry watched him write. He did not at the time have the vocabulary for what he was watching, but he understood that he had been alone with one other person for 1 year, 4 months, and a number of days, and that the apartment had now contained, briefly, 3 people, and that this was a different number of people. He looked at the 4-legged thing on the table. The 4-legged thing looked at him. It walked with great patience across the table and stood on Genos's notebook. Genos went very still. He lifted a metal hand and let the patroness sniff it. The patroness declined to sniff. It walked through his palm instead and dissolved by the edge of the table. "Astonishing," said Genos. "100 more," said the master. Year 2 went faster than year 1. Time does that occasionally when there is someone else in the room. Harry trained, Genos trained. The master watched the television and ate his weight in udon. He asked Harry once in passing what he wanted to be when he grew up, and Harry said, "I don't know," and the master said, "Cool," and the question was not asked again. There was a Tuesday in the late autumn of year 2 that lived in Harry's chest for a long time afterward. Harry had been running. The streets of Z-City near sundown took on a particular kind of orange that smelled like a kitchen and a foundry at once. Genos had been ahead, then beside, then ahead again, the way a person who runs because he was built to runs alongside a person who runs because he has to. They turned a corner and met a thing. The thing had 8 legs and an opinion about Genos. It was, by Z-City standards, mid-tier. It had the kind of mouth a parent does not want to describe to a child. It had been, Harry would later understand, what Z-City called a tiger threat, which was bad in the way a thunderstorm was bad and not in the way a skybender was bad, and the local heroes were busy elsewhere, and the thing had 4 city blocks in mind. Harry, who had been running for 8 kilometers and was not in the mood, raised one hand and produced a fireball that turned midair into a small white light. The thing was in the next second no longer the thing. It was a black mark on the pavement and a curl of warm air that smelled like an iron eaten by the sun. Gino stopped running. He turned. He looked at Harry. He looked at the black mark. He looked at Harry again. He did not blink because he was not designed to. "Fellow disciple," he said. Said Harry, "You did not say anything. Number, was that a fireball or a patronus?" Harry thought about this. "Both," he said. "I was on the curb a minute ago. I needed to be on this corner. I combined them." Geno's took out the notebook. That evening at home, the master, who could smell singed asphalt from across a city, looked up from his rice once and said, "Tiger." "Yeah," said Harry. "You okay?" "Yeah, cool," said the master and went back to his rice. Harry slept like a stone that night. He did not know why. The four-legged thing curled at the end of his blanket, which was supposed to be a stylistic choice patronuses didn't make, and was nevertheless making. By the end of year 2, Harry had fireballs that could be small or large, patronuses that could be silver or near invisible, silent castings that worked from any room with a window or a door or a wall, which was most rooms. He had a wand, sort of, a chopstick the master had broken in half and which Harry had kept using. He cast through it because casting through things felt politer. Several months later, when the Hogwarts letter arrived, Harry would discover that he was supposed to have a real wand and the chopstick would be retired. It would never quite leave the kitchen drawer. Geno's kept his notebook full. Geno's spells worked differently. He had no magic technically, but he had a great many other capacities, and he was practicing in the human style anyway because the master had said to. The master had not said this. The master had not said anything specific, but Geno's believed the master had said it in spirit, which was sometimes enough. Year 3 was a strange year. Harry was 10. Harry was very strong. Harry kept training. There were small adjustments. The four-legged thing by then had grown so well-mannered it would appear at meals and lie next to the table like a dog that had read a book on what dogs did. The fireballs in year 3 were boring. Harry could light a stove by looking at the burner. The silent castings were so silent that the master, a man whose ear could hear a price tag sticker rustle, sometimes did not register that Harry had cast anything until the room had been cooled or the door had been latched. Boredom moved into Harry the way damp moves into a wall, slowly. From the inside, he did not notice at first. Then one afternoon he walked into the kitchen, asked the master what was for dinner, and watched the master point at the rice cooker. He felt, somewhere in the middle of his chest, a thing the size of a coin and the temperature of nothing. "Master," he said, a word he had only recently begun to use. Geno's habits were catching. "Is this it? Is what it? The training? Am I finished?" The master considered him. He considered the rice cooker. He considered, perhaps, the price of cucumbers. "Yeah," he said, "what do I do now? Live, I guess." "Live how?" The master, who had been about to bite a cucumber, paused. He lowered the cucumber. He looked at Harry, and the look was, for a man of his face, a look. It contained more than his face normally contained. "Find people who like you," he said. "Not because you're strong, because you're you." Harry blinked. He had not expected words like that out of a face like that. "Hey," he said. The master bit the cucumber. The conversation, by his standards, had been operatic. Late in year 3, the letter came. It came by owl, which was perhaps the only piece of post the apartment had received in a year, and it came in through a window that was supposed to be closed but had opened itself the way windows do near magic. The owl was a tawny one, displeased by the journey, very dignified about it. It landed on the rice cooker. It looked at the master. The master looked at it. "You want a fish. It does not eat fish," said Geno's. The owl declined the fish. It accepted a piece of rice and a satsuma rind. It deposited a letter on the low table and waited, with the patience of an owl who suspected its job was about to get harder. The letter was thick. Harry opened it. He read it. He read it twice because the second time he wanted to be sure. "It's a school," he said. "Cool. For magic, they want me to come." "You want to go?" Harry thought about this. He thought about the chopstick in the drawer. He thought about the four-legged thing under the table. He thought about Geno's, who was watching with the still attention of a person who suspects he is about to be assigned somewhere. He thought, briefly, of Privet Drive, which was a place he had stopped thinking of as anywhere a long time ago. He thought of the master's words about people who liked him for being him. "Yeah," he said, "I think I do. Cool." The next week was busy in the way that weeks are busy when nothing is happening but a person is preparing to be somewhere else. A second letter arrived, hand-delivered. The hand belonged to a tall woman in tartan green who arrived on the landing without knocking and looked at the apartment with the expression of someone who had expected stairs and had been given a corridor of accumulated discount flyers. Mr. Potter, yes. Professor McGonagall, deputy headmistress, may I come in? Sure, said the master from the couch. She came in. She took in the room. She took in the four-legged thing which had appeared on the low table and was watching her with the careful courtesy patronesses tend to give witches in tartan. She took in Geno's, whose metal arms were arranged neatly in his lap. She took in Harry, who was 11. His birthday had passed without speeches, small, and not in the slightest a description of any orphan she had been told to retrieve. Mr. Potter, she said again more slowly. You are well, yeah, you have been taught, yeah, by whom? Harry pointed at the master. The master waved. McGonagall, who had not waved at anyone in some time, did not wave back, but did pay attention to him in a manner that approached a wave. You are a wizard, sir. Nah, she turned to Harry. He is not a wizard. Number, yet he taught you. Yeah, she breathed once slowly. She produced a parchment that she explained was a consent form. She read it aloud. She got to a place where a guardian was meant to sign. She offered the master a quill. Got a pen. A pen, she said, would not adhere to the parchment. The master, undisturbed, fished into his pocket. He pulled out a flyer. The flyer was creased. The flyer was, in fact, the original flyer from the first day, which Harry had not until this moment realized had been kept. The master extracted from it a small coupon. He looked at the coupon. He nodded. This worked. McGonagall, after some seconds, said, I shall make it work. She made it work. The coupon, attached to the parchment with a charm Harry could not yet see the shape of, accepted itself as a signature. McGonagall regarded the master with the careful regard of a woman who had stopped looking for the third strangest thing in a room. He is to be accompanied by a guardian on the platform, she said. He may additionally bring a companion willing to enroll as a transfer student under our exchange program. Geno's straightened. His golden eyes brightened by an increment that meant a great deal to Geno's. I shall accompany him, he said. Cool, said the master. The letter to Geno's arrived 3 days later, with apologies for speed and an enrollment form that asked, among other questions, his country of origin. Geno's wrote, after some deliberation, Z-City. He was not asked to clarify. Diagon Alley was a great deal of street folded into a small one. The pub through which one entered was full of people who had decided early in life that they were going to be wizards and were prepared to commit. They moved aside for Harry without being asked to, and without registering that they had done so, which Harry was beginning to notice. The master came with him in tracksuit and slippers and walked through Diagon Alley with the indifferent confidence of a man who had once walked through a wall built specifically to keep him out and not noticed it. Ollivander's shop was a long room of small drawers. The drawers were thinking. Ollivander stood among them like a librarian among books that had once eaten a librarian. He looked at Harry. He looked at the master. He looked at Geno's metal hands. He decided, visibly, to address none of these. Mr. Potter, he said, I have been expecting you. Okay, said Harry, try this. He produced a wand. He set it in Harry's palm. The wand began to glow gently. It also began by degrees to look afraid. Said Ollivander. He took it back. He produced another. The second wand declined to glow. It declined to do anything. It refused, in fact, to be a wand at all and behaved instead like a small piece of expensive wood. Said Ollivander. The third wand exploded, not dramatically. The way a teacup explodes when set down too firmly, politely, but as a definite statement. Said Ollivander. Got something quieter. Said the master. Ollivander, who was beginning to take in the master as a phenomenon, vanished into a back room. He returned with a long, slender box. He opened the box. Inside, on a bed of dust, lay a wand of pale wood with a grain that suggested it had grown up around something complicated. Holly and phoenix feather, he said. 11 inches, supple, made some time ago. Harry took it. The wand did not glow. The wand did not do anything dramatic. The wand sat in his palm with the relieved stillness of a small animal that has finally been picked up by the right person. It will do, said Ollivander. Cool, said the master. They left. They bought a trunk that resized itself politely. They bought robes that did not in any direction. They bought books that argued among themselves on the shelves and were, by the time they were carried home, in a settled order Harry had not asked them to assume. They bought, on the master's insistence, a sale-priced box of soup noodles because they were on sale. The morning of September 1st arrived the way mornings do, without consulting Harry. The master, awake at an hour he was unaccustomed to, drank tea from a chipped cup and looked at the wall for a time. Harry stood beside him in the kind of jumper an 11-year-old wears when he is no longer 8 and has not yet decided what 11 looks like. Don't blow up the school. Okay. Don't show off. Okay. Find friends. Okay. The master nodded once. He produced from a kitchen drawer something Harry had not known was there, a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Harry without further ceremony. Harry opened it. It was a list written in the master's careful, blockish hand. It said, "EGGS bread, rice, soy sauce, don't die, groceries," said the master. "While you're gone." Harry, who at 8 had received a list that had ended "Do not be ugly," folded this new list and put it in his pocket. He kept it there for a year and a day. At King's Cross, the master stood on the platform in his yellow tracksuit and looked at the brick wall between platforms 9 and 10 with mild interest. He did not say goodbye. Goodbyes were beyond his stylistic range. He patted Harry on the shoulder with hands that could have flattened a building and did not. He nodded at Gino's. He turned around and walked in slippers in the wrong direction down a Muggle platform and was gone before Harry was through the wall. The train was red. The train was loud. The train was a great deal of train. Harry stood beside Gino's in the corridor of the Hogwarts Express and looked out of the window at the world in which he was about to be the strongest person and possibly the most bored, and probably both at once. The four-legged thing paced once around his ankle and faded out of being. Harry put his hands in his pocket. His fingers found the grocery list. The paper was warm from his pocket and from no other reason. He yawned. Gino's noted it down. Chapter 2. The boy who yawned. The compartment had been empty for 40 seconds when the door slid open and a boy with bright orange hair fell into it sideways. Sorry, Fred elbowed. Sorry, said the boy, who was scraped and freckled in the precise wrong shape for the doorway he had come through. He picked himself up. He saw Harry. He saw Gino's. He saw the way Gino's metal hands were folded politely over his lap. He saw on the seat between Harry's knees a four-legged silver thing that had not been there a second before and was now grooming itself with the unconcerned dignity of a cat in a strange kitchen. The boy, whose name had not yet been said, opened his mouth and closed it. "Hi," said Harry. "Ron," said Ron, like a person answering a question he had not been asked. "Ron Weasley." He sat down opposite Harry without quite looking away from the patroness, which dissolved as a courtesy. Sorry. "You're your friend, has he got metal arms?" said Gino's. "Yes, right," said Ron. "Right, I am called Gino's. I am a transfer student. I am pleased to meet you." "Right," said Ron. "Same." He blinked at Gino's. He blinked at the seat where the patroness had been. He looked after a long moment at Harry, and the looking caught on a thing it had not expected to catch on, which was Harry's forehead. "You're him," said Ron. "I'm Harry," said Harry. "You're Harry Potter." "Yeah, blimey." A silence settled in which Ron tried to decide whether to apologize for saying blimey and decided not to. He sat. He pulled out a sandwich. The sandwich was corned beef. The sandwich appeared to be in the process of regretting itself. "Mum always packs corned beef," he said mournfully. "She knows I don't like it." Harry, who had spent 3 years cooking rice and discovering in passing that he liked cabbage, considered this problem. "Trade," he said. He had on the seat beside him a paper bag with 3 onigiri the master had pressed into his hands at the platform, an apology in the shape of food. Ron looked at the rice triangle. Ron looked at the corned beef. Ron looked at Harry as though Harry had handed him a small kingdom. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, okay, yeah." Gino's accepted the corned beef on Ron's behalf and disposed of it through a small port in his left forearm, which Harry pretended not to see. Ron ate the onigiri in 3 bites and went very quiet for some minutes in the manner of a boy who had learned a fact about himself. The door slid open again. A girl with a great deal of hair stood in it with the bearing of a person who had been knocking on doors all morning and had developed a system. "Has anyone seen a toad?" A boy called. "Neville's lost one." She did not pause. "Oh, are you doing magic? Let's see then." "We're not," Ron began. "I have," said Hermione Granger. "Read all the set books. Hogwarts, a history, of course, and a history of magic and magical theory, and oh, I'm sorry, that was rude. I am Hermione Granger." Her cheeks were a faint pink. She had clearly noticed Gino's, decided he was a problem to address in a moment, and not yet found the moment. "Harry Potter," said Harry. "You're Harry Potter." "Yeah," she breathed in. She did not say blimey. She had read the books. The books had used different words. "I know all about you," she said with great seriousness. "I read modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts and great wizarding events of the 20th century. You're in them all." "Cool," said Harry, who did not know about the books and would not particularly look at them. She turned to Gino's. She had been holding the question. The question came out. "Are you," she said, "a wizard number? Are you a robot?" "Yes." She digested this with the methodical precision she would later apply to logic puzzles and time turners. "From where?" "Z-City." "I have not heard of Z-City." "No," said Gino's, "it is far." Hermione nodded slowly in the way of a person who has just been given the first piece of a puzzle she will spend years assembling. She sat down. She produced from inside her robe a book, then another, then a third. The third was a notebook. She uncapped a pen. She wrote Z-City in clear hand and underlined it twice. "How did you meet Harry?" she said without looking up. through master, who is master, our shared teacher. Hermione wrote teacher on the line below Zcity and looked the next moment at Harry as if Harry had become a different and possibly larger book. You have a teacher, she said. Had, said Harry. He graduated me, sort of. What did he teach you? Harry thought about it. Fireballs, he said, and happy ghosts, and how to not say anything. Hermione wrote fireballs and happy ghosts and not say anything in her notebook and underlined nothing, which was, for Hermione, a sign of profound disturbance. What kind of school, she said slowly, teaches fireballs as a foundational subject? Not a school, said Harry. An apartment, in Z-City. Hermione closed the notebook gently. She placed it on her lap. She folded her hands on top of it. She looked for a number of seconds out of the window of the train at the green country that was deciding whether to be Scotland yet. Right, she said in the voice of a person rebuilding a worldview from the foundations. Right, I see, yes, right. The trolley rolled by. The trolley lady asked them what they wanted. Harry, who had never bought sweets, bought 2 of everything and gave 1 of each to Ron. Ron, who had never been given 2 of everything, did not know how to be given 2 of everything, and so dealt with it by smiling so widely his ears moved. Hermione, after some thought, also bought a chocolate frog. She watched the frog escape, leap once, and freeze in midair an inch from Genos's metal fingers. Genos lowered it back into Hermione's palm without flexing more than 2 joints. Thank you, said Hermione distantly. Of course. Genos sat back. He folded his hands. He observed Hermione observing him. He did not speak. He had at some point decided about Hermione, although what he had decided would not be obvious for another 3 weeks. By dusk the train was slowing. By full dark it had stopped. There was the great pleased noise of a giant calling first years, and the wet sound of small boats, and the long, slow, expensive moment when Hogwarts came around a bend and presented itself with the casual extravagance of a castle that knew exactly how to be photographed. Blimey, said Ron, who would say blimey several more times over the next 7 years. Yes, said Hermione, who would not. Cool, said Harry. Genos took a photograph with his eyes. The great hall was a great hall. The ceiling was telling itself the sky. 4 long tables held an organized mob of children in pointy hats, watching the first years come up the center aisle with the studied carelessness of people who had also themselves recently been first years and were trying not to remember it. McGonagall stood by a stool. The stool bore a hat. The hat had a mouth. When I call your name, said McGonagall, you will come forward. I will place the hat upon your head, and you will be sorted into your house. The hat had been singing in the moments before with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of an old man who does not know his trousers have a stain. It sang about courage. It sang about loyalty. It sang about cleverness. It sang about ambition. The first years had stood in front of it with the careful neutrality of children being told who they were. Names were called. Children went forward. The hat declared houses with the brisk decisiveness of an auctioneer. Granger, Hermione, Gryffindor, after a wait which Hermione would mention frequently for the next 6 years. Potter, Harry. The hall did the thing it did, which was a long shared inhale that no one quite let out. Harry walked up the aisle without registering the inhale. He sat on the stool. McGonagall lowered the hat. The hat went on his head. It settled. It said him. It paused. It said him a second time, which it did not usually do. There was a longer pause. The hall, after some seconds, became aware that it had become aware. People shifted on benches. Said the hat aloud. Genos, in the line of first years, he had quietly inserted himself because he had been told to be sorted with the year group, watched without blinking. I don't quite know what to do with you, said the hat, less briskly than usual. Its voice had gone confidential. There's not very much here, you see. Harry, inside the brim of the hat, considered this. Sorry, he said with some politeness. No, dear boy, it's not bad, well, there's a kitchen in here, there's a fridge, is that an egg? Probably, said Harry, there's a chopstick, there's a man in a yellow tracksuit on a couch, he's not paying attention. There's a 4-legged thing under a table, is that a patronus? Why is it under a table? He likes it under there. I see, said the hat, who did not. There's a corner with a bin in it, there's a cucumber, there's a sale flyer, the flyer is a great deal of the apartment, actually, there's not much else. Harry was silent. Where are you keeping the rest of it? Said the hat, with something that was in a hat anxiety. The rest of what? The parts of you. The courage, ambition, the fear, even fear is useful. There's not a hook here. There's nothing for me to catch on. Harry was by then slightly bored, and his boredom radiated very faintly into the space the hat had been searching. Gry, the hat began, more in self-defense than in conviction. Gry, it tried again, a little more firmly, perhaps because brave was not currently a useful word, but not afraid was a near enough cousin. Gryffindor. It shouted in the end, as one shouts a guess at a quiz, with no time left on the clock. McGonagall lifted the hat from Harry's head with the briskness of a woman who recognized, at a great distance, an irregularity that would later be her problem. Harry stood. He went to the table that was clapping. He sat next to Ron, who beamed. He smiled briefly at Hermione, who was watching him with an expression that for Hermione was a frown. Genos. The name on the parchment was Zcity, Genos of. McGonagall had elected to read it backwards. Genos went up. He sat on the stool. The hat went on his head. The hat said "oh," and then said "right," and then said, with the brisk efficiency of a librarian shelving a book in the only available section, Gryffindor. Genos walked to the table. He sat opposite Harry. He removed a small notebook from his sleeve and wrote, Gryffindor by elimination. Hermione sat down the next bench along, leaned across, and said very softly, Harry, what did the hat see in there? Harry shrugged. Some stuff. It said there wasn't a hook. Hooks, Harry. Yeah, hooks are how it sorts. Yeah, it usually says better be Gryffindor or Slytherin within 15 seconds. Yeah, she closed her mouth. She opened it. She closed it again with the air of a girl who had decided to investigate something later and was making a note in advance. Dumbledore stood. Dumbledore said the sort of words an old man says when he is mostly saying them to be sure his voice still works. Dumbledore looked once down the Gryffindor table, and his eye paused for nothing more than a breath, on Harry, who at that moment was buttering a roll with the absorbed politeness of a child who had not had bread that someone else had baked in some years. Dumbledore sat down. Dumbledore did not particularly eat. At the staff table beside him, a tall man in black ate with the offended precision of a man who suspected his food. A man in a turban sat one seat over. The turban smelled wrong. Harry had not yet identified the smell because he was eating a roll, and the smell was, to a boy who had been trained for 3 years in a kitchen that smelt of soy and discount cabbage, a thing to be located in a second moment, not the first. But he noticed it. He noticed it the way you notice a draft in a sealed room. That one, said Genos under his breath in his very small, very precise indoor voice, smells of two. Yeah, said Harry. He ate his roll. The man in the turban felt the look. He had not, by any of the means available to him, including the means available to his passenger, registered Harry's eyes as eyes. He had felt them as a thing in the air, a thing like a cold wind from a door that should be shut. He shifted on the bench. He drank water. He spilled water. He set down the glass. The other man in black, the tall one, looked at Harry across the hall in the way a tall man in black looks at a child he has decided in advance not to like, and the look bounced off the boy and came back to him with the disinterest of a returning letter. Harry buttered a second roll. The first weeks of Hogwarts were the gentle blur all first weeks are. Charms, transfiguration. Herbology, where Hermione watched a devil's snare retract politely from Harry as he leaned over a workbench and underlined a paragraph in her textbook and then crossed it out. History of magic, in which the ghost teaching the class fell asleep mid-lecture and the students ate biscuits. Potions, where, but potions deserves its own paragraph. Severus Snape, who had loved Lily Evans imperfectly and hated James Potter for the rest of his life, had been planning the first lesson in his head since Tuesday. The lesson had a sequence. The sequence began with a stare. The stare was a thing he had practiced. The stare was to be followed by a question about asphodel and wormhood. The question was to fall with the satisfying click of a trap that had been laid in a child's father's lifetime, upon a child who did not know the answer. The child would flounder. The child would be humbled. The lesson would proceed. The lesson proceeded as follows. Ah, said Snape in a voice you could chill wine in. Yes, our new celebrity. Harry, who was sitting in the third row beside Ron, looked up from his cauldron, which he had not yet been told to ignite. He met Snape's eye in the unalarmed way of a person who, when very small, had decided once and for all what real meanness looked like, and had since revised the bar upward. What would I get, Potter, if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormhood? Draft of living death, said Harry, who had read the book on the train because there was a long train and Hermione had been making lists. There was a small pause. Snape's eye narrowed by perhaps a millimeter. Where would you look, Potter, if I asked you to find me a bezoar, stomach of a goat? What is the difference, Potter, between monkshood and wolfsbane? They're the same plant. The pause this time was longer. The dungeon, by all the laws of a dungeon, had been built to have echoes. The echoes were silent, because every student in it had decided in the same moment to be silent. Well, said Snape very quietly, let us see whether celebrity can brew. The lesson proceeded with the slow, fastidious cruelty of an experiment whose result is known. Snape moved between desks. Snape sneered. Snape, by the end of the hour, had stopped sneering because he had walked past Harry's cauldron and seen a draft the color of clear morning light, steam coiling above it in the precise pattern of a textbook diagram, and Harry had not, technically, been told to brew anything. Snape did not say a word about the cauldron. He said 5 other words to Neville. He left the room in a particular kind of motion. Later, in his office, he sat very still for some time. He had ways. He had since the age of 17 been the foremost legilimens of his generation, a fact he did not particularly enjoy and had not parted with. He had decided by the end of his second cup of tea to look into the head of Harry Potter and find out what was in there. The opportunity presented itself one Friday at the staff table during pudding. Snape positioned himself casually at the end of the head table nearest the Gryffindors. He waited until Harry had a forkful of treacle tart raised halfway to his mouth and was looking, not directly at Snape, but in the general region of up, which was enough. Snape stretched his mind out, in the very thin way mind stretches out, and entered. What he found was not what he had been promised in any book. He found, in the way one finds rooms in dreams, a kitchen. There was a low table, there was a baseball game on a television. There was a man on a couch eating cucumber, looking at a flyer. The man did not look up. The man did not by any standard appear to be a man one disturbed. There was the faint smell of soy sauce. There was a window which, although closed, was somehow letting in a great quantity of air. There was a small 4-legged thing on the table, watching Snape, very polite and very interested. Snape, in this kitchen, attempted to look around for something hookable, somewhere a memory ought to be stored, the way memories are stored in halls and vaults in the back rooms of theaters of selfhood. There was nothing. The kitchen continued. The kitchen continued for a long time. There were several rooms in the kitchen. Each room was a kitchen. The man in the tracksuit did not look up. Snape, who had at this point spent rather more time in Harry's mind than was usual for a first attempt, attempted to leave. The 4-legged thing on the table stood up. It paced once around the edge of the table. Snape, for the first time in 15 years, had the experience of being looked at by a creature he had not invented or permitted. It was the look the family dog gives the burglar when the burglar has the silverware in his hand. The man in the tracksuit very mildly turned his head, looked at the 4-legged thing, said, "Hey," and gave it a small nod. Snape was, the next moment, sitting at the head table holding a spoon that was halfway to his mouth and was no longer interested in him. He set the spoon down. He did not eat the treacle. He looked at Harry. Harry looked at him in passing, in the way one looks at a man who has dropped a spoon, and went back to his pudding. Snape stood. Snape excused himself. Snape did not run. Snape, however, walked with the particular speed of a man not running. In his office he sat for some time and did not light a candle. He did not try legilimency on Harry Potter again that year, or the year after, or the year after that. He did not tell Dumbledore. He could not say why. Pride, in part, largely pride. But also something he had not had a word for in some time, which was the small, private warning a person gets when they have looked at a thing they were not meant to look at, and the thing has, very politely, decided not to react. Yet, Ginos, who had been across the hall during the brief legilimency, watched Snape leave and wrote. The dark robe one tried to enter Master Harry's mind. He failed. Master Harry continued to eat tart. He underlined continued. October arrived with the particular wet of Scotland's October. Halloween fell on a Thursday. The Halloween feast was the Halloween feast, an excessive number of candles inside an excessive number of pumpkins, a confused amount of food, a quantity of bats that managed to be both decorative and inconvenient. Hermione, who had spent the afternoon in the girls' lavatory because Ron had said an unkind thing he was about to spend several weeks regretting, was missing. Ron, beside Harry, was being miserable in the particular way of a boy who knows he has been unkind and has not yet worked out the apology. The doors of the great hall slammed open. Professor Quirrell came running up the center aisle in the manner of a man whose turban was containing the wrong number of emotions. "Troll," he shouted. "Troll in the dungeons, thought you ought to know." He fainted. There was a noise in the hall, the noise of 200 children remembering all at once that they had not, in fact, paid attention in defense against the dark arts. Dumbledore's voice rang above it, calm and excessively pleasant. "Prefects will lead their houses to the dormitories," he said. "Teachers with me." The hall began to drain in the polite chaos of an evacuation. Harry, halfway out of his seat, looked at Ron. "Hermione," said Ron in the voice of a boy who had just remembered something the size of a person. "Yeah, she doesn't know." Yeah, they did not, as the books would later have it, run heroically off into the corridors. They walked. Walking was sufficient. Ron walked because he was 11 and afraid of his own legs at speed. Harry walked because Harry had not needed to run anywhere in over a year. Ginos joined them at a corner. "Master Harry, Ginos, there is a troll." "Yeah, shall I number as you wish?" They came around the third corridor and a thing was in it. The troll was, by troll standards, fine. It was 12 feet tall and smelled like the inside of a long-closed shoe. It was carrying a club the size of a small piano. It was looking with the slow, vague hunger of trolls everywhere into the girl's lavatory door. The door opened. Hermione, who had heard the breathing, had emerged. She saw the troll. The troll saw her. Hermione, who was, despite first impressions, 11 years old, did the only thing it is reasonable to do at 11, which was scream and step backward into a sink. The troll lifted the club. Harry, hands in his pockets, said, "Hey." The troll turned. The troll, with all the difficulty trolls have facing more than one thing, looked at Harry. It considered the situation. It made its decision. The decision was to swing the club. The club came down with the slow, committed certainty of a tree falling. Harry did not move. He raised one hand, palm out very slightly, and the club arrived against his palm with a sound like a polite knock on a wooden door and stopped there. The troll stared at its own club. The club stared back. The club had not been told that this was an option. "Hi," said Harry, who had not yet learned to address trolls but was making it up. He gave the club, very gently, a small push. The club went backward at the exact speed the troll had brought it forward. The troll, attached to it, went backward also. It hit the corridor wall with a noise that several portraits later described as unflattering. The troll slumped. The troll developed on its head a bump the size of a teacup. The troll, in the manner of someone whose evening was over, began to snore. Hermione, by the sink, made a noise that was not a word. McGonagall arrived first. She had run. McGonagall in motion was a thing the older students passed around like an heirloom in story. She arrived in the corridor with her wand out and her tartan all over the place, and saw the troll asleep, and saw Hermione in the doorway and Ron a step behind her and Harry, hands in pockets, looking faintly bored, and Gino's at his shoulder with a notebook. Snape arrived next. His robes were the wrong way around the wrong direction. He was limping. There was, Harry would notice this and not say anything for some time, a quantity of fresh blood on his left calf. Quirrell arrived third, sweating, with a turban that had developed a strong opinion in the last 5 minutes. McGonagall, who could read a corridor the way she could read a transfiguration, looked at the 3 children and the troll and the bump on the troll, the size and exact position of the bump and the wall behind the troll, which was now a slightly different shape than it had been at breakfast, and the look on Hermione's face, and made her decision. "Miss Granger," she said, "Professor McGonagall." "What in the name of Merlin?" Hermione opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it. She said, "I went looking for the troll. I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. Harry and Ron came to find me and saved my life." She said it with the careful, steady cadence of a person discovering in real time that they could lie. McGonagall looked at Hermione. McGonagall looked at Harry. McGonagall looked at the troll. 5 points from Gryffindor," she said, "for sheer dunderheadedness, Miss Granger. 5 points to Mr. Potter and Mr. Weasley for sheer dunderheaded luck. 20 points to the new boy for restraint." She inhaled, she exhaled. "Off to your dormitory. Now." They went. Halfway up the staircase, Hermione caught Harry's sleeve. You stopped it," she said in a small, clear voice. "You stopped the club with your hand, Harry. That club was a metric ton." "Yeah, Harry, yeah." She looked at him in the way she would, later, look at certain doors in certain libraries. "All right," she said. She let go of his sleeve. She walked. After a few steps, however, she came back. She did the smallest thing. She took his hand briefly for 2 seconds and let it go. "Thank you," she said. Gino's noted this down also. He underlined hand. Ron, 3 steps behind, was practicing the apology he had been practicing since the lavatory, and would finally deliver in another half hour, badly and well at once. And from that moment, Ronald Weasley would belong to 2 people for the rest of his life. Up at the staff table much later, Dumbledore sat with his hands folded over a cup of tea that had gone cold. McGonagall came in. McGonagall stood in front of him. "Albus, Minerva." He stopped a fully grown mountain troll with his hand. "I am aware." The hand was Albus. The hand was casual. "I am aware." She did not sit. She stood. "Albus, yes. What did we do to that boy? Where has he been?" Dumbledore stirred a sugar into his cold tea. He watched the swirl. He spoke without looking up, with a softness he saved for very few sentences. "He has been somewhere we did not put him," he said, "and he came home." McGonagall studied him for a long moment. "You are afraid of him," she said. "Albus." He set the spoon down. "Of him," he said. "Number no, Minerva. Number I am afraid of what we are going to ask him to do." He lifted the cup. He set it down again, untasted. "And of what he will not need to do." He looked after a moment up the long hall toward where the Gryffindor table had been earlier full and was now empty. "And perhaps a little of what he will not, in the end, need us for." He drank his tea then in a small, slow swallow, and did not speak again that evening. Out in the dormitory, Harry lay on his back in a 4-poster bed and looked up at red velvet hangings. The bed was the largest bed he had ever slept in. The bed was in fact a number of beds sewn together. He had not yet decided whether he liked it. The window beside him was a small leaded square the color of new ice. The patroness was on the foot of the bed, curled, watching the ceiling with him. He took the grocery list out of his pocket. He smoothed it on the blanket. He read it. He read it again. Eggs, bread, rice, soy sauce, don't die. He folded it. He put it back in his pocket. He looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was the same color as the kitchen ceiling at home. This was a coincidence. This was not, in any wider sense, anything. Harry slept. In the room downstairs in the staff wing, the defense professor's turban was talking to itself in the small, wet voice of two minds, one of which was furious and the other of which was sweating very hard for both of them. "He felt me," said the smaller voice. "He felt me. I felt him feel me." "He is a child," said the larger voice, very low, very calm, very wrong. "He felt me. He looked at me. He is a child." The turban shook on its head for a very long time, in a small, mechanical, frightened motion. 2 floors up, in a dormitory full of sleeping boys, a 4-legged silver thing stood at the foot of a bed and watched, without blinking, in the direction of the defense wing, until it was sure of what it had decided to be sure of, and then dissolved gently into the dark and went somewhere only patronesses go. The first term of Hogwarts had begun. Chapter 3, Quirrell-Mort. Briefly, the thing about being very strong is that the world arranges itself, after a while, into the shape of someone trying to make sure you don't notice. Harry noticed. He didn't particularly mention it. It began in the spring with the dog. The dog had 3 heads. Harry came across it by accident on the 2nd of February on the 3rd floor while he was looking for an empty classroom in which to think for half an hour. The classroom marked on his mental map was in fact behind a door with the kind of brass handle a child trusts and an adult does not. He turned the handle. He pushed open the door. He looked at the dog. The dog looked back. It looked back 6 times, twice from each head. It barked in unison. The unison was impressive and the volume was not pleasant. It rose to its feet, which were the size of cushions. Harry, who had stood at the doorway of his own cupboard at the age of 8 and listened to a great deal worse than barking, considered the dog. He considered the room. He considered what the dog was standing on, which was a trapdoor. He noted the trapdoor. He hummed. He hummed at the dog. He hummed an unimpressive low note, not loud, in the precise pitch the master had hummed at the radio every Tuesday night when the baseball game was over and the apartment was quiet. He hummed because it had occurred to him, suddenly, that dogs are sometimes asleep and that a thing can be helped along. The dog's left head looked at him. Its eyelids drooped. Its center head looked at the ceiling in that slow, doubtful manner of a person searching for the source of a smell. Its right head sat down. The left head joined the right. The middle held out for a few proud seconds before the 3-headed dog, in its entirety, settled with a whump of heavy fur and was asleep. Harry pulled the door shut. He went and found an empty classroom, where he sat on a windowsill and thought about whatever he had been planning to think about, and did not mention the dog or the trapdoor to anyone. Hermione, of course, found out about the dog within 9 days. She found out because Hermione was the kind of girl who, once she had a fact, refused to let go of it until it was a system. She found out because Ron had heard the twins describe a corridor they had been not quite told to avoid. She found out because Hagrid said Fluffy twice in the same conversation when he had only meant to say it once. In Hermione's hands the dog became, by the end of February, a paper, a written summary in 2 neat columns of what we know and what we do not know. "You looked at the dog," she said to Harry in the library on a quiet Tuesday. "Yeah. Why? Wrong door. What was the dog standing on? Trapdoor. What is under the trapdoor? Don't know." "Don't you want to know?" Harry considered this with a fair amount of patience. He looked briefly out of the high library window at the late February sky, which was the color of a bruise that had decided to heal. "Not really," he said. Hermione sat very still for some time. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page, wrote "Harry does not want to know," underlined it 3 times, and decided on Harry's behalf that she did. The dog was one of 7 obstacles. Hermione learned this mostly over April and May, by the slow accumulation of overheard things and small lit clues. There was a flying key room. There was a chess set. There was a troll, which they would later be relieved to learn had already been done. There were potions and riddles. There was, at the end of the corridor, a mirror. The mirror was the one Harry was interested in. He had, in fact, met the mirror earlier in the year, by accident, again in another wrong room. He had stood in front of it on a cold January night and seen something. He had stood in front of it long enough to know what he was seeing. He had not stood in front of it long enough to want to see it twice. What he had seen was a kitchen, a low table, a baseball game on a television, a man on a couch eating a cucumber, looking at a flyer. The man did not look up. The man did not, by any standard, appear to be a man one disturbed. He had stood in front of the mirror with his hands in his pockets and watched the mirror tell him he wanted to be exactly where he already was. He had nodded once courteously to the reflection and walked out and not gone back. Hermione, on the other hand, was clever enough to know how the mirror worked without ever having stood in front of one, and bothered by what she could not see. So when in the last week of May, a series of small wrong things began to happen, Hagrid's dragon, Norbert, the detention in the Forbidden Forest, the cloaked thing among the unicorns, Quirrell's stutter, which was at certain moments not so much a stutter as a stage prop, Hermione began to draw a line that ran, on her diagram, from the third-floor corridor to the staff table to the defense wing. "It's Quirrell," she said. They were in the common room. The fire had gone the color fires go when they have been there for too long. "Yeah," said Harry. Ron looked up. "Wait, Quirrell, Quirrell stutters. Yes, that's the whole personality. Yes, he shakes. Yes, he's Quirrell. Yes, it's Quirrell. Yes, okay." There was a longer silence. Then Hermione, with the precise patience of a person who had been managing 2 boys for a year, said, "I think they're going to try to take the stone tonight." "Yeah," said Harry, who had been thinking the same thing for some hours and had been gentle enough not to mention it. We should tell Dumbledore. Dumbledore's gone." "What?" "He got an owl from the Ministry. Gino saw it. He left for London at 5. That's not possible. That's suspicious." "Yeah," said Harry. "Then we go ourselves." Harry, who had been about to say yeah a 5th time, paused. At Hermione. He looked at Ron. He looked briefly at Gino's, who had appeared in a chair without ever having moved and who was watching him with the still calm attention of a younger brother. "We," said Harry. He tried the word. It did not by itself suit him. He had had 3 years of training in which there had been no we. And yet, "Yes," said Hermione. "We." "Okay," said Harry, who had been given good advice once and remembered it. "Find people who like you, not because you're strong. Because you're you, okay." They went in the small dark hours in cloaks that Harry had not bothered to acquire because the corridor took one look at him and forgot to be a corridor on principle. They went past the portraits, which murmured. They went past Mrs. Norris, who looked at Harry, considered the thing she was looking at, and made the small political decision of cats and looked away. They came to the third-floor corridor. "Right," said Hermione in her own private voice. "Right, step 1, dog. Already done," said Harry. She turned. "What? He's asleep." Harry, the dog is Fluffy. The dog is currently awake and currently dangerous and currently." Harry opened the door. The 3-headed dog was asleep. It had been asleep on Harry's hum for 3 months and 12 days. Hermione, in the doorway with her own wand out and her own perfectly prepared plan, looked at the dog, at the trapdoor, at Harry, at the dog again. She closed her mouth. "Right," she said. "Right." Ron, behind her, said something the portrait gallery would not have approved of. Gino's opened the trapdoor. They went down. The devil's snare reached up for them like devil's snare does. It was a foot from Hermione's neck, and it had decided about her. Harry, mildly inconvenienced again, looked at it. The devil's snare, which was as old as the castle and had certain instincts, looked at Harry. There was a long second in the dark green dark. The devil's snare let go of Hermione. It let go of Ron. It folded itself with the immense, weary dignity of a plant that had decided to be small for some minutes into a corner of the chamber and waited there politely until they had passed. That's not how devil's snare does," said Hermione faintly. "It's polite," said Gino's. "It is not polite, it is carnivorous." "It has decided to be polite tonight," said Gino's. The flying room flew its keys. Harry, who did not particularly need the broom, walked up to the door it locked and put one hand against the wood and felt for the small spring of magic that was the key on the other side. The lock clicked open. Hermione, by the broom, said, Oh, all right then." They went through. The chess set was Ron's. The chess set had always been going to be Ron's. Harry stood politely at the side of the board for half an hour while Ron, frowning, moved pieces and stood, in due course, on a queen's square, and was knocked out, and bled lightly from one ear, and would brag about it accurately to his sons for the rest of his life. Hermione knelt by him with her hand on his shoulder and her eyes wet, and Harry, who had stood by patiently because Ron needed to stand on a queen's square, knelt the other side and felt for the blade and stopped it without saying any word and looked at Hermione, who looked at him, who nodded. "Go," said Hermione in a voice the night had thinned. "I'll stay with him." "Go." "Yeah," said Harry. Be careful, Harry." "Yeah," he said, who had stopped knowing what careful meant. Gino's hesitated. "Stay with them," said Harry. "Master Harry, stay." Gino's bowed. He stayed. Harry walked alone through the next door. The next room was a riddle of bottles. Harry, who had once seen the master figure out, by squinting at it, which of 2 brands of soy sauce was more dilute by mass, looked at the bottles for some seconds and picked the one he had been going to pick anyway. The fire in the doorway licked at his sleeves and then went very low and decided not to be a fire while he was passing. He went through. The next room had the mirror in it. The mirror was tall. The mirror was framed in gold, the color an old man dreams gold to be. The mirror had carved at its top, in letters reversed, the legend Eris stra eruoit ube kafruoit on wosi. In front of the mirror, with his back to Harry, stood a man in a turban. The man was talking to himself. Not here, not here, not here, where? He was running his hands along the gold of the frame, in the spasmodic, urgent, wrong movements of a man under instruction. Use the boy, said another voice. The other voice came from somewhere in the back of the man's head, which is to say from inside the back of the man's head, which is to say from the back of the turban. Yes, master, yes, the turbaned man turned. He turned because he had felt in the back of his neck a thing that was not a wind. Quirinus Quirrell saw Harry. Quirinus Quirrell saw in Harry's face none of the things he had been trained to see in the face of a boy, including fear, including curiosity, including pride, including youth. Quirinus Quirrell saw what one sees when one looks at a closed door. Potter, he said. Yeah, said Harry, you should not have come down here. Yeah, you will look in the mirror and you will tell me what you see. Harry very politely looked into the mirror. The mirror showed him a kitchen, a low table, a baseball game on a television, a man on a couch eating a cucumber looking at a flyer. The man did not look up. The man, this time, looked up. The man looked at Harry through the mirror with eyes that did not really do looking and gave him a small, indifferent shrug. The shrug said very mildly, do whatever, kid. The shrug said don't blow up the school. The shrug said be home for dinner. The shrug said one of these days the cabbage is on sale and you should try to be there for that. Harry, in the mirror looking back, returned the shrug. In his pocket, the chopstick, which he had not in the end retired, pressed gently against his hip. Inside the mirror, beside the kitchen, behind the kitchen, in the back room of the kitchen where memory was kept, and a small four-legged thing had a corner with a blanket, a stone the color of dried blood arrived in the pocket of Harry's Reflections tracksuit. Harry felt the stone in his own pocket the next moment, where it had not been a moment before, the way one feels a pebble in a shoe. What do you see, boy? Said Quirrell with mounting interest. What do you see? My family, said Harry, who had decided in advance that this was the lie he would tell. And they're proud of me. And that's all. The voice from the back of the turban, low and dry and personal, said, he lies. He lies, master. He lies. Let me see him. Let me speak to him. Quirrell, with the stilted, slow gestures of a man who has been doing the wrong thing for years and is being asked to do something specific, raised his hands to the wrap of his turban and began, fold by fold, to unwind it. The cloth came away. The cloth came away further. The cloth, at the last turn, fell to the stone floor of the chamber in a small dead sound. Harry, who had been 3 years in a kitchen, considered the thing on the back of Quirrell's head with the calm distaste of a person who has, finally, identified the smell. The thing on the back of Quirrell's head was a face. It was a face the way a stain is a face. It had the wet whiteness of something that lived underwater. It had eyes. It had nostrils. It did not mercifully have a mouth in the strict sense. The mouth was a slit, and the slit was talking. Harry Potter, said the face, in the slow, stretched sibilance of a creature who had practiced the words. Yeah, we meet at last. Yeah, come closer. Harry, without moving, said, number. The face's small, wet brow contracted. It had not, in some years, been told no by a child. It had not in some years been told number. It had not, perhaps in any of its lives, been told no with the particular bored politeness of a boy who had been told once that he should not stand close to faces on the back of teachers' heads by a man who never said anything twice. I will teach you, Harry Potter, said the face. I will teach you. I will show you power. Cool, said Harry. Power beyond your imagining. Cool. I knew your mother, boy. I knew your father. I have a use for you. Harry, who had been waiting patiently for the part where Quirrell did the thing that meant he had to be stopped, watched Quirrell raise one hand. The hand came up. The hand bore the long, thin shape of a wand. The wand, by the dialect of wands, was an entrance to a sentence Quirrell was about to begin. The sentence was likely to be a killing curse, the face on the back of his head having decided by now that this conversation had run its course. Harry raised his own hand, with the chopstick wand in it, a wand of holly with phoenix feather, Mr. Ollivander's by adoption, and said, with neither emphasis nor drama, stupefy. The room thought about it. The room, and this is the only way to put it, thought about it. The stone of the floor felt itself thought about. The gold of the mirror felt itself thought about. The dust in the corner felt itself thought about. The thing on the back of Quirrell's head felt itself thought about in a way that was uncomfortable. There was a sound. The sound was the sound a polite cough makes when a continent moves in a different room. The mirror shattered. It shattered not from the spell but from the kindness of the air, which had had to move out of the spell's way and had not, on a few seconds' notice, found anywhere better to go. The gold of the frame stayed where it was because gold has a sense of decorum. The glass fell as pieces of glass fall, which is to say in slow, accidental music. Quirinus Quirrell was no longer Quirinus Quirrell. He was a great many small light things in a shape that very loosely recalled a man, and the small light things were already losing track of the shape. The thing on the back of his head, the face, the slit mouth, for a half instant opened. It opened in the manner of an old wound that has been disturbed. A great long high scream rose out of it. The scream was the scream of a wraith who had been certain, until that moment, of a number of things, and was not now certain of any of them. The scream filled the chamber. The scream went up the chimney that wasn't there. The scream went out of the castle's stones by ways the castle had not, until that moment, known were ways. The wraith fled. It fled through the wall. It fled by the cold movement of cold air, out of the third-floor corridor and over the west tower and out over the lake, in a long, thin, pale streak that the few owls awake at that hour pointedly did not follow. The chamber was quiet. Harry put his wand away. He looked at the place where the mirror had been. He noted mildly that the stone had ended up in his pocket some minutes before he had cast anything, which was a thing the mirror had done on its own initiative, and which he would, later, mention politely to Dumbledore. He bent. He picked up Quirrell's turban from where it had fallen. He folded it. He laid it on the small heap of glass and dust like a tablecloth. It seemed the right thing to do. He walked back through the rooms in the order he had walked through them: riddle, chess, key, plant, dog. Each room led him through with the soft attentiveness of rooms that had decided they were not going to interfere with anyone who had been polite to them on the way in. Gino's was where he had been left, in the chess room, with Ron's head in his hands and a small, precise application of warm metal at Ron's temple. Hermione was on her knees beside them, 2 fingers on Ron's wrist. She looked up. "Quirrell," she said. "Gone. The stone." He took it out of his pocket. He showed it to her. He put it back. She did not say anything for a while. Then, in a different voice, she said, "Harry. Yeah, I am not going to ask you tonight what kind of school teaches stupefy like that. Okay, I will ask tomorrow. Okay." She wiped her hands on her trousers briskly. She looked back down at Ron. Ron by then was awake and was saying blimey in the small, low voice of a boy who has met his queen's square. Gino's lifted Ron. They went up through the corridor. Madame Pomfrey, who had been awake against her own better judgment, took them in. Dumbledore arrived the next morning. He came to the hospital wing without being announced. He stood at the foot of Harry's bed in his lemon-pale robes, with his beard in some order. He had aged, Harry would later think, in the night, more than in any of the nights before it, not in the obvious ways, but in a softening around the eyes that was not all gentleness. "Harry," said the headmaster. "Sir, are you well?" "Yeah." "May I ask you something?" "Yeah." Dumbledore sat down on the chair beside the bed, in the unhurried manner of an old man with bad knees who had decided, this morning, not to perform old manishness. "The boy who came up out of that chamber," he said very softly, "was not, I think, the same boy who went down into it. And the boy who went down was, I confess, Harry, not entirely the boy I had expected from his letters." "Sorry," said Harry. "There is nothing to apologize for. I am only wondering." "Yeah, who taught you magic, Harry?" Harry, who had a piece of chocolate in his hand, Madame Pomfrey having insisted, and Madame Pomfrey being a woman whose insistence had its own gravitational mass, bit the corner off. He chewed it. He swallowed. He answered. "A bald guy," he said. Dumbledore looked at him. Dumbledore, and this was the thing that would, in due course, get back to McGonagall, laughed. Not a great laugh, a small, soft, surprised one, the laugh of a man who has, after a long stretch of being afraid, briefly remembered how. He bowed his head over his hands. He sat for a small moment with the corner of his beard against his chest. "A bald guy," he repeated. "Yeah. And what did the bald guy ask you, Harry, when you were learning?" 100 fireballs," said Harry. 100 patronesses, 100 silent castings, 10 kilometers every day. Dumbledore wrote this down. He had no quill. He wrote it with the small motion of his thumb on the back of his other hand, which was, in his own private system, how he stored things he intended to think about. He sat very still afterwards, and "the stone," he said. Harry took it from the pocket of his pajamas. He handed it across. Dumbledore turned it in his fingers in the careful way one turns an object one cannot quite afford to drop, and tucked it away under his sleeve. "Thank you, Harry." "Yeah." Dumbledore stood. He stopped. He turned back. "Harry." "Yeah, he is not gone, you know." "Who, sir?" "The man you met last night, without his face on. He will return." "Cool." Dumbledore's eyes, for a half-second, went the way eyes go when an old man has decided in private that he is going to let himself be amused. "Cool," he repeated very softly. He inclined his head. He left. Out in the corridor he walked for some way before he stopped. He stopped by a tall window. He put a hand on the stone of the sill. He stood like that for some minutes, and only McGonagall, coming along the corridor and seeing him from a distance, did not interrupt. Up in Gryffindor Tower, in a 4-poster bed with the curtains drawn, Hermione Granger was writing a list on a fresh piece of parchment. The list was titled Things Harry Potter Can Apparently Do, and the list had 3 columns, and the columns were headed Confirmed, Suspected, and I Do Not Want to Think About. The third column was the longest. She underlined the heading I Do Not Want to Think About once. She did not underline it twice. She closed the parchment in her notebook and went down to breakfast and did not mention the list to anyone, ever, although Ron once, in his 4th year, would catch the back of one page of it and would, after a moment of unfocused looking, decide to also not mention it. Down in Z-City, and this is not a thing Harry knew then or later, a man in a yellow tracksuit on a couch lifted his head at 3 in the morning local time, looked at the wall opposite him, said, "Huh," and went back to a flyer that had at last gone on its 3rd of July sale. He did not particularly look concerned. His patroness, for he had by then accidentally acquired one, in the manner he acquired everything, which was by sitting still in the wrong place at the right time, paced once around the low table, looked very briefly in the direction of Scotland, and lay down. Chapter 4, the Triwizard Joke. 3 years passed in the manner 3 years pass when a boy is bored. 2nd year happened. There was a basilisk in the pipes. Harry, who had spent an afternoon, out of mild curiosity, learning to speak to the 4-legged thing's snake cousins in the gardens of Z-City, asked the basilisk politely to go to sleep. It did. He pulled it out of the chamber by the tail, with one hand, in the unconcerned manner of a fisherman pulling a long rope. He laid it across the trophy room floor. He gave it a small towel in case it woke up cold, and he did not say anything to anyone because Hermione would have asked questions and Ron would have screamed for the entire afternoon. The diary in the chamber he stunned with a flick of the chopstick wand. Ginny Weasley woke up in his arms. She was by then 10 years old, the appropriate age for being saved, and she would, in due course, recover from the saving by becoming a person with whom Harry would, after some years, occasionally have tea. 3rd year happened. Sirius Black escaped Azkaban. Sirius Black snuck into Hogwarts. Sirius Black met, in a corridor, a small 4-legged silver thing watching him with the unblinking interest of a creature waiting for an introduction, and Sirius Black, who had been a marauder, recognized a patroness and followed it because he was a man whose curiosity had never quite become wisdom. The patroness led him to a window. Through the window stood Harry, eating an apple. Harry recognized Sirius from a photograph the master had, entirely by accident, kept folded in a drawer of the apartment with several discount coupons. Harry handed the apple to Sirius. Sirius took it. They had a conversation, the contents of which Harry would not ever repeat in full. By the end of it, Pettigrew had been sneezed out of Ron's bed by a small wandless gust, identified and arrested. Sirius Black, free, became, as he had always wanted to be, the godfather of a boy who did not, in any sense, need a godfather, but who was glad to have one anyway. He sent letters. By the end of the 3rd year, Hermione had updated her Things Harry Potter Can Apparently Do list 8 times, and decided not to keep it any further, because she had run out of columns. 4th year was the year of the Triwizard Tournament. The announcement came at the welcoming feast, after the sorting, with Dumbledore standing up before the puddings to speak in his unhurried voice. The schools of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang would visit. A great old contest, dormant 100 years, would be revived. 3 champions would be selected, 1 from each school. The contest involved 3 tasks. The contest had traditionally killed people. Dumbledore did not exactly mention this. He let the older students mention it for him with the small, smug noises of boys who knew older things than younger boys. "Cool," said Harry to Ron, around a chicken leg. "You're not going to enter," said Ron. "Number. It's restricted to 17 and up anyway." "Cool. You don't even want to." "Number, all right then." Hermione, opposite, watched this exchange with the air of a woman watching a small earthquake she could already predict. Beauxbatons arrived in a carriage drawn through the sky by horses the size of elephants. Durmstrang arrived in a ship that came up out of the lake the way a whale, having made up its mind, comes up. The students from both schools were, broadly speaking, taller. They settled in. They studied the menus. They examined Hogwarts with the careful disdain of guests who have, in their luggage, brought their own home. The goblet of fire was set up in a circle of age charm in the entrance hall. Bartemius Crouch SR, austere, with a mustache so neat it looked drawn on, explained the rules to a hall full of students who had not, in any meaningful sense, been listening. A great many older students put their names in over the next 2 days. The goblet considered them and brooded, the way goblets do. On Halloween evening, the goblet sat in the center of the hall in its blue flame, with the air around it the particular kind of waiting air an old object waits in. Dinner ended. Dumbledore stood. The goblet's flame went red. A piece of paper shot out of the flame. "The champion for Durmstrang," said Dumbledore, catching it, "is Victor Crumb." The hall applauded. Crumb stood up. He had the face of a thunderstorm caught in a chair. He went through to the side chamber. The flame went red again. The champion for Beauxbatons is Fleur de Lacre. Fleur, silver blonde, rose with the smiling impatience of a girl who had practiced the smile in a mirror. She went. The flame went red a third time. The champion for Hogwarts is Cedric Diggory. Cedric, tall, fair, with the kind of face that smiled an apology before it had to, stood up at the Hufflepuff table, smiled an apology, and went through. The flame went red a fourth time. Dumbledore did not particularly move. The hall, which had been about to start clapping a second round in farewell to Cedric, lost the clap. The goblet on its plinth gave the small wet sigh of a kettle deciding to whistle. A piece of paper shot up out of it. Dumbledore caught it. He read it. He read it again in the way a man reads an obituary he had not been told to expect. "Harry Potter," he said quietly. The hall did not particularly respond. It was looking at Harry Potter. Harry Potter was looking at his pudding. The pudding was treacle tart. The treacle tart did not, in any particular way, deserve what was happening. Harry sighed. It was a small sigh. It was the sigh of a boy who had been given a chore he had not asked for. It traveled the length of the long table and was heard by McGonagall, who was watching him at the staff table with her hand at her throat. Harry stood up. He walked, with both hands in his pockets, to the side chamber. The four-legged thing trotted alongside him for one polite step and then dissolved. In the side chamber, the three champions turned. Fleur frowned. Crumb frowned. Cedric, who had not yet learned to frown, frowned approximately. "Have you brought a message?" said Fleur in a tone the syllables had practiced. "No," said Harry. "Sorry, they said my name, I don't know why." "You are 11, said Crumb. 14, you are too young." "Yeah." The door opened. The teachers came in, Dumbledore in his lemon robes, looking older than the morning, McGonagall sharper than the morning. Snape, who at the sight of Harry made a small, precise expression that was the closest his face came to weather, Crouch SR in his mustache. Ludo Bagman of all people in a jacket, Karkaroff on edge, Madame Maxime peering down over a quantity of bosom. "Harry," said Dumbledore, "did you put your name in the goblet?" "Number, did you ask an older student to put your name in for you?" "Number, do you know who did?" Harry looked at Crouch SR. Crouch SR looked at Harry. Crouch SR's eye, which had been twitching very slightly all term, twitched again. Crouch SR became in Harry's mind marked. Harry did not say anything. Hermione had taught Harry by now a thing about how to not say things. "No," said Harry. "Then we have," said Crouch SR, with the satisfaction of a man delivering an unhappy fact, "a binding magical contract." The teachers argued for some time about whether the contract was binding. The contract was binding. The contract had been binding from the moment Harry's name had come out of the goblet, by an old rule that did not care which year a student happened to be in. The contract was binding even though Harry, who was 14, did not, by any reasonable reading of the rules, qualify. "I don't want to do it," said Harry into the argument. "You have to," said Karkaroff with bitterness. "Yeah, you will compete. Yeah, you will compete and you will lose. Yeah." Karkaroff stared at him for some seconds. Karkaroff had not, in his long career as a man whose career had survived making the wrong choices, ever had a child say yeah to him in that exact cadence. Karkaroff went slowly, several shades paler. The first task arrived in late November and had dragons in it. Harry, in the tent the morning of the first task, sat on a folding stool and ate an apple. The apple was the kind of red apple that on television suggests poison. The apple was, in this case, only an apple. Cedric was opposite him, also on a folding stool, also with an apple. They had got into the habit over the autumn of eating apples together before tasks because the apples had been left in the tent and someone had to eat them, and neither of them had wanted to start a conversation. "Horntail," said Cedric. "Yeah, mine's the Swedish." "Yeah." Cedric chewed for a while. He had grown to like Harry. He had grown to like him in the difficult way an older boy likes a younger boy he cannot, by the rules of older boyness, openly approve of, by gentle insults, by the offering of small advice, by tucking him at the back of every photograph. "Harry." "Yeah, could you try to make it look hard?" Harry chewed his apple. "I'll try," he said. He was by then 14 and able to lie a great deal more comfortably than he had been able to lie at 12. "Just for the audience, you know. They'll be expecting, yeah, all right then." The dragons were dragons. The Horntail, when Harry walked out onto the arena, lowered its head and looked at him in the way a great cat looks at a smaller cat at the edge of a great cat's territory, with annoyance, with conviction, with menace. The Horntail roared. Harry, halfway up the arena with the egg on a plinth 30 meters away across an obstacle course of rock, sand, and small skittish fire, considered the dragon. He considered the audience. He considered Cedric's request. He considered the chopstick wand in his pocket, which the chopstick had by now quite forgotten it had ever been a chopstick. He sneezed. The sneeze was a small, polite sneeze. It went into the back of his hand. It was the sneeze of a person who has, perhaps, dust in their nostrils. The horntail 20 yards away paused. The horntail blinked. The horntail's wings, which had been beating with the ill temper of a dragon defending an egg, slowed. The horntail's nostrils, which had been smoking, ceased to smoke. The horntail folded its long, heavy neck around the egg mound on which Harry's target egg was sitting, settled its enormous head on its forelegs, and shut its eyes. The arena did not, for some seconds, respond. The arena could not, in fact, respond, because it had not, in living memory, watched a champion sneeze a dragon to sleep. The arena, after some seconds, began to applaud, on the wave principle by which arenas applaud anything that has more than the usual quantity of dragon involved. Harry walked through the obstacle course. Walking through was not, technically, more difficult than running through. The rocks moved for him politely, having got the idea from the dragon. He picked up the egg. The egg was the size of a melon and the color of frosted gold. He carried it under one arm. He nodded to the horntail, which did not see him because it was asleep, but which, in its sleep, may have nodded back. Hagrid, in the audience, wept on Ron's shoulder. Ron, in the audience, said the word blimey approximately 6 times with rising precision. Hermione, in the audience, looked at her hands, which were folded on her lap, and did not raise her voice or her hands, and was the first to stop applauding because she had a list to add to in a notebook later. The judges gave Harry 10s. Karkaroff gave him a 4. The crowd booed the 4. Karkaroff did not look up from his parchment. Cedric came over later in the changing tent. He had survived his own dragon by half-transfiguring a boulder into a dog. He was, in the polite manner of all very good Hufflepuffs, both impressed by his own performance and embarrassed by it. "Harry," he said, "yeah. That was a great deal less hard than I asked for. Sorry, it's all right. I sneezed. I noticed. I tried." Cedric, smiling, and his smile by now was less an apology than a habit, clapped him on the shoulder. He shook his head. He left. In the seats above the arena, very high up, a man in a turban that was no longer a turban, for Quirrell was dead and Quirrell would stay dead, sat huddled in a thin damp shape inside a tin of dust and felt, across the great distance between a champion and a half-life clinging to a hairbrush, the small calm gravity of the boy on the arena. The shape inside the tin shivered. It said in its small dry voice, "Not yet and not now, and first the body, and then I will know, and then I will be more than a body." In another seat in another part of the stands, Bartemius Crouch Jr., wearing the face and hair and walking stick of Alastor Moody, by Polyjuice and the inattention of the staff, watched Harry walk back to the tent with the dragon egg. Crouch Jr.'s real face had a tick at the corner of the lip. The tick on Moody's face registered only as a slight twitch. He had a flask at his hip. He took a sip from it. He smiled, which was something Moody did not particularly do. Hermione, 3 rows away, saw the smile. She did not exactly understand it. She noted it. She would in due course understand it. The second task was in February. The egg by then had been figured out. Hermione had figured it out. Cedric had figured it out with hints from Harry, because Harry had decided at Christmas that he liked Cedric Diggory and that he was not going to make Cedric Diggory lose a tournament. The egg sang in water, an underwater song about a thing being taken away from each champion at the bottom of the Black Lake. On the morning of the task, Harry did not exactly take gillyweed. He had a small piece of it in his pocket in case anyone asked. He had decided the night before that walking was less trouble. Walking was less trouble for 2 reasons. First, walking was easier than swimming. Second, the master had in year 2 in passing mentioned that water was, by mass and intention, just a great deal of small things keeping their hands politely linked, and a person with enough of an opinion could ask the small things to unlink for an interval long enough to walk through them. Harry had not, until that morning, particularly tested this. He had not particularly needed to. He walked out onto the platform at the lake's edge. The whistle blew. The other 3 champions dove in. Crumb had a shark head and looked, briefly, surprised by his own snout. Fleur had gillyweed and a quantity of unhappy hair. Cedric had a bubblehead charm, which was the polite British solution. Harry, hands in his pockets, walked off the edge of the platform. He did not go down, he went forward. The surface of the lake, where his feet would have broken it, decided otherwise. The surface met his soles with the small soft resistance of a carpet over an iron floor. He took a second step. A third. The lake, considering, decided to be a path for him. He walked across it. The crowd in the stands did not, for a number of seconds, respond. The crowd had been told what to applaud at Quidditch matches and at duels. The crowd had not been told what to do when a 14-year-old in jeans walked the surface of the Black Lake, as though the Black Lake had been a long, polite hallway with a rug. Hermione, in the stands, put both her hands flat on the bench beside her. in the way she would later put her hands flat on a table at 24 in a courtroom when a case had stopped surprising her. Ron, beside her, said something the portraits would not have approved of. Halfway out across the lake where the mermaid village was, Harry sank politely with his permission and walked on the bottom of the lake. The merpeople moved aside for him with the courtesy mermaid courts manage when they have decided, suddenly, not to ask questions. Ron was tied to a rock. That was the thing Harry had been told to retrieve. It turned out, the thing he would miss most, and Harry untied him and threw him over his shoulder. Hermione was tied to the next rock. She belonged to Krum. Harry, who had not been asked to retrieve Hermione, looked at Krum's tag and at the time and at Krum's currently shark head, which was making the kind of bubbles a man makes when his swim is not going as planned, and made the decision a tournament rule was not going to make for him. He untied Hermione. He hooked her gently over his other shoulder. He walked back up out of the lake. Cedric, surfacing with his sister, watched Harry walk out of the water dry with two people draped over him as though they were towels. The judges argued for some time. Karkaroff gave Harry a 4 again. The crowd had stopped booing him because the joke had become, somewhere in November, less funny than boring. Bagman gave Harry a 10. Madame Maxim gave Harry, after a long pause, a 9 and added a half mark and added a quarter mark and stopped at 9 3/4 because the parchment ran out of room. Dumbledore gave Harry the highest score. Dumbledore had been watching Harry the entire task. Dumbledore had, after Harry had untied Hermione, looked away. The third task was the maze. The maze in late June was a great green geometry on the Quidditch pitch with the moonlight on it, set with sphinxes and blast-ended scroots and other small jokes Bagman had invented in the spring. Harry went into the maze at 9:06. Cedric went in 2 minutes later. Krum went in next. Fleur went in last. Inside the maze it was quieter than outside. The hedges were taller than they had any business being. The stars were doing the thing stars do when no one's particularly watching them. Harry, in the maze, walked. He met Fleur in the second corridor. She had been stunned by something Harry could smell on her sleeve, a small wrongness in the air, and Harry, without thinking about it, sent a red spark up over the hedge, which was the signal to the marshals, and the marshals came for her. He met Cedric 4 corners later, being slowly cornered by a boggart in the shape of a Dementor. The boggart, to its credit, was very accurately a Dementor. The Dementor stopped being a Dementor when Harry walked around the corner, looked at it, and the boggart, which was a thing that knew what was good for it, became a small, embarrassed lamp. Cedric, laughing with relief, sat down on the grass and wiped his face. "Tea," said Harry. "What? I brought a flask." He took it out of his cloak. He poured. The tea was hot. Cedric stared at him. "Harry, yeah, you brought tea. Yeah, to a task. Yeah." Cedric drank his tea. Cedric looked at Harry as a man looks at a friend he has decided to keep. They sat by the hedge for 2 minutes. They did not talk. The maze was quiet around them. They came to the center of the maze together. In the center of the maze stood the cup. The cup was bronze. The cup glowed in the unhealthy, faint blue glow Bagman had specified. The cup had on it, when Harry looked at it more carefully, the small, almost invisible silver shimmer of a Portkey enchantment, the kind a polite charm instructor would never have approved of for a competition trophy. Cedric, half a step from the cup, raised a hand. "You take it, Harry. Number, you take it. You've earned it." "I didn't." "You did. I sneezed at a dragon. That counts." Harry looked at the cup. He looked at Cedric. He looked at the cup again. He registered without urgency, in the way he registered most things now, the wrongness of the shimmer. "We'll take it together," he said. "Are you sure?" "Yeah, 3 on 3. They counted 3. They took the cup. Each of them put a finger on the bronze. The bronze hooked. The night went sideways the way Portkey nights go. In the stands the crowd looked at the center of the maze, where until a half-second before 2 boys had been standing, and saw in the place where they had been the small empty bronze square the cup had left on the grass. The crowd applauded. The crowd had not by then been told what the cup was meant to do. The crowd thought a champion had been declared. The crowd was wrong about this. A long way off, in a graveyard in a hamlet called Little Hangleton, Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory, hand on bronze, arrived on the ground of a tomb. The tomb's headstone read, Tom Riddle. A small man in a hood with a small fat hand that ended in nothing came around the side of the tomb. "Kill the spare," said a voice from a bundle the small man was carrying, a voice none of them except Harry had heard in person before. The small man raised his wand. He pointed it at Cedric. He opened his mouth. He began to say a word that would, in any reasonable world, end Cedric Diggory's life and a great deal of his father's joy. Harry, without turning his head, without making a single one of the larger gestures of warning that, in another story, would have made a sentence, extended one hand sideways. The green of the curse left the small man's wand. The green of the curse 3 feet from Cedric did not arrive at Cedric. The green of the curse arrived instead at Harry's palm, where it changed its mind. Harry, very gently, with the offhand neatness of a man taking a fly out of a kitchen, returned the green back to where it had come from. The small man, who was Pettigrew, screamed once. He did not die. Harry had decided in the moment that he was not, in fact, going to kill a man tonight. That was a thing the master had said once at a grocery store, and which had stayed in Harry's head, that the strongest thing you could do sometimes was not, and Pettigrew instead lost his other hand, which fell off in a small wet noise on the gravel, and fainted. The bundle the small man had been carrying said in a high cold voice, "What?" "Hi," said Harry. The bundle said, "What?" Chapter 5 Graveyard Tuesday. The bundle on the ground said what twice more and then said nothing, because the resurrection ritual was a ritual on a schedule, and the schedule had not been written with a great many interruptions in mind. Pettigrew on the gravel breathed in the wet flat way of a man without 2 hands. He whimpered. The whimper went on and on at a volume he had not been planning. He had in his pocket, in a small jar, the bone of Riddle Sr. already taken. He had in another pocket the flesh he had been intending to cut from his own arm, which he could not now cut from the arm he no longer had. He had in his head a list very neat, written out the previous week in the small wet handwriting Voldemort had given him, of 3 ingredients: bone, flesh, blood. 2 of the 3 were now logistically complicated. Cedric behind Harry said, "Harry." "Yeah, that was Harry, was that the killing curse?" "Yeah, and yeah, Harry, what?" Harry looked at Cedric. Cedric was tall and fair and the kind of 17-year-old who, when a killing curse passed within 3 feet of him, had still not, in his own head, become the kind of person to whom that sort of thing happened. "It's fine," said Harry in the small soothing voice he used with Hermione when Hermione had identified a thing. "It is not fine, it's mostly fine, Harry." "Yeah." The bundle on the ground was, in the long thin pause this was taking, slowly working out what to do. It worked it out. It opened the wrapping with the small motion of a thing reluctant to be unfolded. A creature 18 inches long, with the body of a thin infant and the face of a thing about to be a face, crawled out of the cloth onto the gravel. Its hands were the color of long-soaked paper. Its eyes were red. It was, by the standards of any creature its size, a thing it was reasonable to step on. It was, by the standards of legend, the Dark Lord himself in the small, reduced shape Pettigrew had been carrying around in a bag for the last 6 months. The Dark Lord looked at Harry. The Dark Lord looked in passing at the small bald patch where Pettigrew's wrist had been. "You," said the Dark Lord to Harry in a voice that the gravel underfoot did not for a moment want to be in the same garden with. "Yeah, you will hand my servant his hand. He hasn't got a hand. He had 2 hands when we arrived. He's only got 1 wrist now. Then attach something to the wrist." Harry considered this. The Dark Lord on the gravel considered Harry considering it. Pettigrew between them whimpered. A long minute passed. Harry mildly raised 1 hand. He had been thinking, somewhere at the back of the place he kept thinking, of a thing the master had said years before in a grocery aisle with 3 brands of soy sauce in front of him and a fixed amount of money in his pocket. "Let them think they're winning. It's nicer that way." Harry had not, until tonight, known what the master had meant. Harry now had a small inkling. "Cedric," he said without turning. "Yeah." "Don't move, don't say anything, don't try to fight. All right, I want to see this." "What?" "I want to see this. Stand still." "All right." The Dark Lord on the gravel did not understand what Harry had said. The Dark Lord was, by then, becoming impatient. "My hand," he said, "my servant's hand." Harry mildly mended Pettigrew's wrist. He did not give him a hand exactly. He gave him a thing the wrist was now closed by, a smooth, pale wrist shape with no hand on the end of it. It was a polite mending. It was an enough mending. Pettigrew, whose mouth was bleeding from biting his own tongue, sobbed. "You will give him a full hand," said the Dark Lord. "This is all you get," said Harry, in the small, bored voice he used with Snape. The Dark Lord very slowly registered that he had been answered in a tone he had not been answered in since 1969. He did not respond. He recalibrated. He turned in his small infant body with the dignified, slow movement of a creature who has decided to win the long game. "Wormtail," he said. Yes, master, the bone. Yes, master, cut a finger if you must. Bones we have many, bone of the father unknowingly given." Pettigrew, sobbing, fumbled in his pocket. He produced a small white shard. He sprinkled it into the cauldron beside the headstone. The bone made a small cold puff in the air. The cauldron's water turned the color of bone. "Flesh," said the Dark Lord. Pettigrew began to cry properly. He looked at his own remaining arm. He had been told to cut his arm. He did not, in fact, have a knife anymore, because the knife had been in his cut-off hand, which had been in the wrong hand, which Harry, by an oversight Pettigrew did not quite have the wit to name, had not given back. He fumbled. He sobbed. Harry mildly inconvenienced, and this would later get a particular underline in Hermione's notebook when she heard about it. Harry was mildly inconvenienced by an ongoing resurrection ritual, took out the chopstick wand, made a small gesture, and a knife appeared in Pettigrew's other hand. It was a small, clean kitchen knife of the kind the master used to cut spring onions. It was, by the standards of resurrection ritual knives, embarrassing. Pettigrew, sobbing, He cut his own forearm. He held the wound over the cauldron. Flesh dripped in. The cauldron hissed. "Blood," said the Dark Lord. Pettigrew, with the small, ruined precision of a man who could no longer afford to make mistakes, raised the kitchen knife and approached Harry with the air of a person approaching a man-eating tiger with a fork. "Hold him," said the Dark Lord. There were ropes that the Dark Lord had been planning to bind Harry with, for the bone-flesh-blood ritual had 3 sources, and the third source was Harry himself. These ropes, which were curled in a black coil at the foot of the tomb, lifted, on the Dark Lord's instruction, into the air. They went toward Harry. They got within 3 feet of Harry. They stopped. They considered. They returned slowly to the coil at the foot of the tomb, in the manner of a young animal coming back from the doorway of a kennel it had decided not to enter. "What are you doing?" hissed the Dark Lord to the ropes. The ropes did not particularly answer. Ropes never have, in Harry's experience, particularly answered when spoken to. Harry very mildly said, "I'll just stand still, shall I?" The Dark Lord, who had not had a long career of being told, "I'll just stand still, shall I?" nodded. His small infant face had, in the last minute, lost some of the early triumph it had been wearing. Pettigrew, knife trembling, took Harry's left arm. He cut. The cut was shallow. Blood dripped. The blood went into the cauldron. The cauldron hissed in earnest. The cauldron, in fact, lit. Steam rose. The graveyard around them was lit in the small, unhealthy red of a thing happening on schedule. Out of the cauldron came a man. The man was tall and pale and the color of bone that had been kept indoors. He had no nose in any useful sense. He had 2 slits. He had eyes the color of low-grade rubies. He was wearing the black tailored robe Pettigrew had laid out beside the cauldron in the careful manner of a valet. He raised his hands in front of him and looked at them and flexed them and smiled the small private smile of a man who had been smaller than usual for 13 years. "Ah," said Lord Voldemort. He stood. He stretched. He looked then at Harry. He took in Harry slowly. Harry, in the small space of stillness while Lord Voldemort took him in, had by then decided. He had been deciding since the bundle had said what. He had been deciding since the ropes had refused to come to him. He had, at the back of his head, heard the master's voice the way one hears a song through a wall. "Let them think they're winning. It's nicer that way." He had decided not to do it tonight. He had decided this because tonight Voldemort had a number of followers in this graveyard. Harry could feel them, the slow popping arrival of apparition behind every other tree, the small wrongness of a great many cold men coming forward. If he ended Voldemort tonight in the way it could be ended, the followers would scatter, and the followers would, in their scattering, be a problem for many years. Better to let Voldemort gather them. Better to let Voldemort believe in a thing for the night. Better to take the portkey home and let the war begin in the open, and end it when the time came, in one place, on one lawn, in one breath. This was not a thing Harry had been taught. This was a thing Harry, 14, had worked out alone in the soft dark. It would later become the thing about him that the master, hearing about it third hand from Geno's with several adjustments, would actually nod at. "My friends," said Voldemort to the popping arrivals, come closer." The Death Eaters came forward. There were 15 of them. They were the second string, the ones who had been close enough to apparate. The inner circle had been told to wait, but they were faithful, and they came forward, and they stood in their hooded circle around the cauldron, and the tomb, and the boy with the knife cut on his arm. "Harry Potter," said Voldemort, and his voice in the open air was a thing that had been practicing for 13 years. "You came to me through Wormtail's small effort. You are here because I have brought you here. You are here because finally I have you alone, and I have the body to face you with." "Yeah," said Harry. "You will not, I think, leave this graveyard. Cool. You will, cool." The Death Eaters in their circle looked at each other under the hoods. 2 of them, Avery, who twitched, and Nott, who licked his lips when he was uncertain, exchanged the small glance Death Eaters exchanged when a Death Eater meeting had gone sideways, and they were not, in the moment, planning to mention it. "I am offering you," said Voldemort in a voice that took some effort, "the chance to die at my hand by my wand, with, perhaps, a small chance to fight first, as your father did. As your mother could not." "Cool," said Harry, who had decided in advance that he was going to say cool as many times as he could get away with tonight. It made the master laugh once, in a memory Harry had not yet had, in a kitchen Harry had not yet returned to. Voldemort raised his wand. Crucio, he said. The curse arrived at Harry. The curse passed through where Harry was. The curse failed, for reasons it could not explain to itself, to find any of the small pain keys it had been made to find. It tried again briefly in confusion. It gave up, it dispersed. Harry, who had been trained, among other things, to remain conscious of where in his body was, did not particularly react. He looked at his own forearm where Pettigrew had cut him. The cut was small. The cut would heal. He looked at Voldemort. Was that supposed to do something? He said. There was a longer pause. The Death Eaters in their circle had by then fallen quiet in the precise way Death Eaters fall quiet when they have begun to suspect they were going to need to leave. Voldemort, who had not in his life been asked was that supposed to do something, took a breath. He took a moment. Ah, he said, you have grown, you have been taught. This is more than I expected. I am pleased. This will be more interesting. Cool. Tell me, said Voldemort. Who taught you? Harry considered. A bald guy, he said. The Death Eaters in their circle did not laugh. They were not by training in the habit of laughing at Death Eater meetings. But one of them, Macnair, who was in some private way a man with a sense of humor, made a small noise that might in another life have been a snort. Voldemort's red eye fixed on Macnair. Macnair stopped making the noise. Ah, said Voldemort, mockery, wit, this is fashionable among the young. Yes, I see. Well, I shall teach you a small lesson in fashion, Harry Potter. He raised his wand. He spoke a word. The word was the killing curse. The curse came at Harry like a great green dog, and Harry quietly, without any movement of his hand that would have been visible to the Death Eaters, with the chopstick wand still in his pocket, apparated, or did not apparate exactly. Did the thing apparating is the small, clumsy version of, stepped sideways out of the path of it, in the small economic way the master had once stepped out of the path of a falling fridge. The curse went past him. It hit the tomb of Tom Riddle Sr. It chipped a corner of the headstone off. Hold still, hissed Voldemort. Sorry, hold still. I am holding still, sorry. Voldemort spoke the curse again. Harry again was not where it was, and where it was empty. The curse went into the gravel. Gravel does not by nature mind. The Death Eaters in their circle were by now practicing looking elsewhere. Hi, Cedric, said Harry over his shoulder conversationally as Voldemort attempted the curse a third time. Hi, said Cedric, you all right? Yes, I think so. You hold the cup. I'll be back in a minute. Harry, yeah. Are you going to kill him right now? Harry considered Cedric. No, said Harry. He looked at the small, frustrated frame of Voldemort, who was trying and failing in the manner of a man trying to climb a glass wall to land a curse on him. He looked at the ring of Death Eaters. He looked at the chipped tomb. He took a small mental note of who was here and who was not. He registered Bellatrix's absence and noted for later the polite shape of a small giggle in his head where her giggle would on another night be. No, he said again gentler. Not tonight. Why not? He has friends who aren't here. If I do it now, the friends will be a problem for a long time. Harry, it's all right, hold the cup, in a minute we go home. Harry, hold the cup, Cedric. Cedric, by then, was not arguing. Cedric had in the last 40 seconds been catalogued in his own head as a person who took advice from a 14-year-old. He had decided he was all right with this. Voldemort, now in full red rage, ordered the Death Eaters to attack. The Death Eaters attacked. They sent curses. They sent 15 curses. The curses arrived at Harry from 15 different directions in the manner of a great many small angry birds. Harry, without unbothering himself, raised one hand. The curses, every one of them, paused in the small, embarrassed manner of birds that had been called back to a windowsill. They paused. They unwound. They went gently back into the wands they had come from and waited there. The Death Eaters looked at their wands. The Death Eaters looked at each other. One of them, Avery, who had not in his career been on the winning side of any duel without 3 other Death Eaters present, turned. Avery very quietly, in the small twitch of his hood that was in him a panic, disapparated. A second one followed, a third. Voldemort hissed for them to stop. They did not stop. They did not particularly hear him. Death Eaters were, by their training, very good listeners when they wanted to be, and very bad listeners when there was a killing curse not landing on a 14-year-old. Wormtail, said Voldemort very low. Yes, master, get up. Yes, master. Pettigrew got up. He stood, holding his wrist. He did not particularly look enthusiastic. Voldemort turned slowly in a long pivot on the gravel to face Harry. He had at the back of his thin, pale brow the small, concentrated fury of a man who had been refusing to recalculate for over a minute and was now finally about to. You are not, he said very low, an ordinary child. Number, you will not die easily. Probably not. This is interesting. Cool. I shall then accept the lesson. I shall accept the delay. I shall return for you. I shall return with armies. I shall return with the inner circle. I shall return with my full power. Cool. Voldemort, who had not been told cool by an enemy in his life and was now being told cool for the fourth time in 8 minutes, gave Harry a look the lake would later see again on a different face. "Mark my words, Potter," he said. "Yeah, I shall come to Hogwarts. I shall raise an army. I shall burn it down. I shall burn it down with you in it." "Okay," said Harry. He turned. He walked back to Cedric. The cup was on the grass at Cedric's foot. He picked it up. He took Cedric's elbow. "3, Cedric," he said. "3." The portkey hooked. The two of them lifted. In the last instant before the graveyard fell away, Harry, who had not been entirely able to resist the impulse, looked at Pettigrew. Pettigrew on the gravel, who had been bracing for something Harry had not done, looked back. Harry, in the manner of a man tipping a waiter, with a small absent flick of his finger, mended Pettigrew's missing hand. The hand grew in the small, uncanny way limbs grow under polite magic, out of the smooth wrist Harry had given him earlier. Pettigrew, holding it up, made a small wet noise. Voldemort, behind him, looked at the hand. The hand was the small hand Pettigrew had been born with, a pink, soft, unimpressive hand, of the kind one writes letters with. It was not in any sense the silver tool he had been promised in the older ritual. It was not in any sense useful. It was, and this would later, in another graveyard, in another year, mean something to Pettigrew, a hand. Harry and Cedric vanished. They landed in the center of the maze. They landed on the grass. The cup between them gave a small last burst of bronze light and went still. The crowd in the stands had been waiting for some minutes. The crowd, to its eternal credit, applauded for some seconds before it noticed that the two boys on the grass were not, in fact, smiling. Cedric sat down on the grass very slowly. His legs had at last become aware of themselves. Harry knelt by him. "Cedric, yes, tea." Cedric, in spite of himself, laughed. It was a small, ruined laugh, but it was a laugh. "Yes," he said, "please." Harry took the flask out. The tea was still warm. There was in Harry's hands a way of keeping a flask warm without thinking about it. Cedric drank. The tea brought him back into a body he had nearly stopped being in. Dumbledore was the first off the dais. McGonagall second. Moody, crouched J.R.'s Moody, with the eye in the wrong direction, was the third and limped fastest. Dumbledore looked at the chipped cup. He looked at Harry's bleeding forearm. He looked at the way Cedric was sitting, with the small, particular quietness of a person who had recently watched a killing curse pass 3 feet from his face. "Harry," said Dumbledore. "Sir, what happened?" Harry looked up at Dumbledore. He decided what to say. "He's back," he said. The hand on Dumbledore's shoulder, the hand of the man who would later be revealed as Crouch Jr., tightened almost imperceptibly. Dumbledore felt the tightening. Dumbledore did not turn. Dumbledore did, however, in the back of his head, decide a thing. How is he back? Ritual. Pettigrew's alive. He did it with my blood. And you, I'm fine. You did not fight him. Harry, with his hands wrapped around Cedric's flask, looked up at Dumbledore for some seconds. He thought about how to phrase the next thing. He decided to phrase it the way the Master would have phrased it. The Master would have said, "I let him have it," said Harry. "Let him have what? Tonight?" Dumbledore did not for a long beat respond. He looked at Harry. He looked at Cedric. He looked at Harry again. "I see," he said very softly. "I see." He stood up. He turned. He looked at Moody. Moody, crouched J.R.'s Moody, was looking at Harry with the particular look a man gives a problem he has not solved. "Alastor," said Dumbledore, with a kindness that had several edges in it. "Take Harry to the hospital wing." Albus. Now Alastor, with Severus and Minerva. It was the with that Crouch Jr. heard. It was the with that meant he was not, in fact, going to be alone with Harry. It was the with that meant Crouch Jr. had been worked out in the last 15 seconds by a headmaster who had, Crouch Jr. would later realize, known something was wrong with Moody for some weeks, and had finally, in the small spaces of the night, decided to know exactly what. McGonagall stepped forward. Snape stepped forward. Snape, who had not since the troll made eye contact with Harry, looked at Harry now in the small, considering way a man looks at a tool he has decided, despite himself, to trust. The 4 of them walked Harry up to the castle. In the office a few minutes later, Crouch Jr., exposed, returned to his own face by a polyjuice that ran out at the wrong moment, fed a small dose of Veritaserum, told everything. He told about the cup. He told about his father. He told about his mother. He told, with the brimming pride of a son for a father he had finally pleased, about Voldemort. McGonagall listened. Snape listened. Dumbledore listened with his hands folded on his desk, and the small, almost imperceptible weariness of a man who had, in his head, already begun to draw up the lists he would need. In the hospital wing, Harry lay on a cot and ate chocolate Madame Pomfrey had again insisted on, with Cedric on the next cot eating the same chocolate, and the two of them did not talk for some minutes, because there was nothing particularly to say. Cedric, after a while, said, "Harry." "Yeah." You could have ended it tonight, could you?" Harry chewed. "Yeah, why didn't you?" Harry chewed. "He has friends," he said. "If I do it now, the friends scatter. Some of them go quiet." Some of them go very quiet, but they don't go away. They go and they make small new bad things for years. I'd rather they all come. You'd rather they come, yeah, to Hogwarts, yeah. Cedric, who had read his history texts more thoroughly than Cedric let on, looked at his chocolate. That is, Harry, that is a brutal sort of mercy. Yeah, you learned that from the bald guy. I learned a piece of it from the bald guy. The other piece I worked out on the way home. Cedric did not for a while say anything more. Then he reached with his hand and took Harry's briefly, in the way an older brother takes a younger one's hand, and let go. All right, he said. Yeah. I'm with you, yeah, thanks. In the headmaster's office several floors up, Dumbledore looked out at the dawn. He had drawn up his lists. He had two of them. One was an order of battle. The other was the names of the people who would, by the end of the year that was now beginning, be at risk. He looked after a long while at the small bronze cup Cedric had brought up from the maze. He set his hand on it. He spoke once into the empty office in a voice that was meant for no one. All right, Harry, he said. He did not particularly wipe his face. The morning came up over the lake. It was, by any reasonable measure, a fine morning. Chapter 6, One Spell. The summer was hot in Z-City, the way Z-City summers were hot. Harry came home on the 2nd of July. He came home in the manner of a person who had been away, with a small bag, a holly wand in a chopstick-shaped wooden case, a four-legged thing trotting at his ankle, and a genos. He let himself into the apartment with the spare key from under the doormat. The key worked. The doormat was a doormat that had been a doormat in the same place for some years, and was, in some quiet way, glad to see him. The bald man was on the couch. He was watching baseball. He did not particularly look up. Hey, he said. Hey, said Harry. How was school? Fine. Cool. The four-legged thing went under the low table. It curled in the place under the low table where 3 years before a Satsuma peel had been. The Satsuma peel was not there now. The Satsuma peel had moved on. The four-legged thing in its absence considered the floor and was satisfied. Genos bowed. Master, hey, I have brought training documentation. Cool. Genos set down on the counter 3 full notebooks. He had filled, in the 4 academic years, a notebook a year and 1 extra. The notebooks had everything. The notebooks would not, in the long run, be useful to anyone. They were, however, very satisfying to Genos. The master picked up the top one. He flipped it open. He read a paragraph. He set it down. He nodded. Cool. Master, the year was eventful. Yeah, there is a war coming. The master looked at Genos. He looked at Harry. He looked after a moment at the four-legged thing under the low table. Yeah, Master Harry chose during the year to not end the conflict. He chose to allow the antagonist to gather forces. He intends to resolve the matter at one location with one engagement. The master nodded. He did not particularly say anything for a while. Then he said, yeah, that's how you do it. He turned a page of the flyer in his lap. He turned another. He held one up midair and showed it to Harry in the small private way the apartment communicated. The flyer said, onions half off. Eat dinner, said the master. They ate dinner. They ate dinner in the small, efficient way the apartment ate dinner. Harry made the rice. Genos cut the onions. The master watched baseball. For 2 weeks they trained, although there was nothing left to train. They trained because it was a thing they did, and a thing one does is a thing one does, and the master had somewhere in the back of his head the small understanding that Harry, even at 14, even now, needed the routine of training, because the training was the place his life had been in for 3 years, and the place his life would very soon have to go to without. In the afternoons, they sat on the low roof of the apartment building, with the small black tar shingles between them and the sky. Genos taught Harry how to read kanji. Harry taught Genos how to fold an origami crane. The master sometimes came up with udon. The udon was always lukewarm by the time he sat down because the master never hurried with udon. On the 8th of August, a tawny owl arrived at the apartment window with a letter from Sirius Black. The letter was in Sirius's slanting hand. The letter said, Bellatrix Lestrange and the brothers Lestrange escaped Azkaban 2 days ago. Voldemort's inner circle is reassembling. Dumbledore asks me to ask you what you intend. He says Harry will know. I trust you to know. Write back, Sirius. Harry wrote back the same afternoon. Dear Sirius, tell Dumbledore I'm coming back the 1st of September. Tell him to let them come. Harry the owl took it. The owl was by then used to the apartment and accepted a small piece of pickled radish. On the 31st of August, the master and Harry and Genos went in the small cool morning to the noodle place downstairs. They ate breakfast. The woman with the one earring had by now learned to like the bald man and his 2 boys. She gave them 3 eggs on the house. You leaving again, she said in Japanese. Yeah, said Harry in his polite Japanese, which was less polite than he would have liked it to be. Be careful, yeah, she wiped the counter. She did not look up. She said in the small flat voice she said important things in, you come back. Yeah, she nodded once. Said no more. She brought the eggs. On the morning of the 1st of September, the master, for the second time in 4 years, walked Harry to a Muggle train station. He walked him in the yellow tracksuit and the slippers. He patted Harry on the shoulder. He nodded at Gino's. He turned in the wrong direction in slippers and was gone before Harry was through the wall. It was Voldemort with patience, the way he had it. He had spent the summer with the inner circle returned, planning a thing. The thing was simple. The thing was the destruction of Hogwarts. The plan had 3 layers and 4 contingencies and a great deal of pageantry. It was, by any reasonable account, the kind of plan a man builds when he has decided he is going to be in a particular field on a particular morning, and the morning will mean a particular thing. He chose the morning of the 7th of September. He chose the morning of the 7th of September because it was a Tuesday. He had a feeling about Tuesdays. He could not exactly say why. Bellatrix, on the 3rd of September, asked him why a Tuesday. Voldemort mildly told her to be quiet. Bellatrix went quiet. On the morning of the 7th of September, the sky over Hogwarts was the color of a peach that had not ripened. Harry was on the front lawn in his school robe with his hands in his pockets. He had walked down the steps without saying anything to anyone. He had walked down past the unicorns in the paddocks and past the small cluster of 7th years who had been planning, that morning, to study by the lake. He had walked through the grass and stood, halfway between the steps and the gates, and waited. Behind him, on the steps of the castle, Hermione stood in the front line with her wand out and her hair pulled back in the particular way Hermione pulled her hair back when she was going to be useful. Ron stood beside her. Cedric, who had stayed on at Hogwarts as an apprentice magical law enforcement officer, a position the Ministry had invented after the 3rd task because no one had quite known what to do with Cedric Diggory, who had survived something, stood at her other side. Gino stood beside Harry, half a step back, with his metal hands at his sides and his gold eyes scanning the gates. The teachers were on the steps in 2 ranks. Dumbledore was at the center of the upper rank. McGonagall was beside him. Snape 2 steps further, Flitwick, Sprout, Hagrid weeping in advance. The Beauxbatons and Durmstrang students who had stayed on for an exchange year had been organized by Madame Maxim and Karkaroff. Karkaroff had returned for the year, with the air of a man who had decided that if a thing was going to be settled in his lifetime, it was going to be settled here, where his pupil had survived a maze, into rank behind them. At the gates beyond, in the long meadow that ran down to Hogsmeade, came the Death Eaters. They came in 3 lines. The first line was the 2nd string, the men who had been in the graveyard 14 months earlier. They had grown more confident over the summer in the way men in masks grow more confident, by drinking together. The 2nd line was the inner circle. Bellatrix, in a black so close to her own black hair the line between them did not quite take. Lucius Malfoy with his cane in one hand and the wand in the other, and the small careful adjustment of his cuff he was doing without thinking. Dolohov, who muttered, Mulciber, Yaxley. The Carrows, brother and sister, identical in their hate. Greyback the werewolf, who was already drooling. The 3rd line behind all of them was Voldemort. He floated an inch above the grass. He had grown a small private ostentation. He was very pale. He had on a robe of black so good it had to have been ordered. He was, by any sensible account, doing better than he had been doing. He raised one hand. The line stopped. Voldemort looked at Harry across the meadow, across the lawn, across 40 yards of grass. Harry Potter, he said. His voice carried in the way voices carried for him, the small magical amplification he had decided about. You have grown since the graveyard. Yeah, you have perhaps decided finally to fight me like a man. Eh? Sure, said Harry in the small bored cadence Voldemort had been waiting 14 months to dislike again. You will fight me, said Voldemort. Here, in view of your school, in view of your friends, the fight will end. The fight will end this time with my hand on your throat. Cool. I have brought with me my inner circle. They are armed. They have come to witness. They will afterward enter your castle and reduce it to its stones. They will reduce the bodies of your friends to a manageable quantity. They will do this thoroughly. You will see them do it with what is left of your eyes before you die. Do you have anything you wish to say? Harry, considering, said, Yeah, hold on. He turned. He turned on the lawn with his hands still in his pockets and looked up at the castle steps. He looked at Hermione. Hermione looked back. He looked at Ron. Ron looked back. He looked at Cedric. Cedric, who had in 14 months learned how to look back at Harry, looked back at him. Harry, in the small space of that look, did the thing he had been working out in his head, since the master had said find people who like you, not because you're strong, because you're you. He had by then a thing he had been holding for some years in his sternum, the size of a coin. The thing had been put in him at 8 years old in a small cupboard. It had been added to by the master, by Gino's, by Hermione, by Ron, by Cedric. It was by now large enough. He took it out in his head. He set it on the grass in his head. He took the chopstick wand out of his pocket actually this time, and rested its tip in the air in the place above the thing in his head. He looked at Voldemort. He cast the spell. Have you ever stood under a tree just as it begins, in absolute silence, to choose to drop a leaf, and watch the leaf, in the long pure idleness of a thing that has been hanging on for nothing in particular, decide to fall? There is a moment before the falling, the moment the leaf has not yet committed to the gesture, in which everything in the tree, every twig and small held breath of bark, attends. The world, for that fraction, is poised, and the poise is louder than any wind. The spell that Harry cast on the morning of the 7th of September began like that. It did not have a name. It had not been named because no one had ever cast it. It was a spell whose ancestry was a fireball and a patronus and a silent casting and a 10-kilometer run, taken in the long compounding way salt is taken into the sea, 100 at a time every day for 1,095 days, multiplied by the boy who had been adding them up. It came out of the wand, and it was, in the first instant, white. It was the white that lives at the bottom of a snowfall. It was the white of the inside of a fresh egg held in a low-lit kitchen. It was the white the master had once worn, before he had been a man with a yellow tracksuit, in another life that the master himself did not remember. It expanded. The expansion was not exactly fast. The expansion was, and this is the only word for it, thorough. The light went in the first half-second from the size of a wand tip to the size of a balcony. By the third quarter of the first second, the light had taken in the full lawn between Harry and Voldemort. By the end of the first full second, the light was the world. The world, which was a particular world on the 7th of September, was the light. There was a sound. The sound was not large. The sound was the size of a man taking a breath in the next room. The sound contained inside it, however, the slow, steady tones of every grocery store the master had ever been to, played at once in the harmony of things that had been on sale for many years. The sound, the lake heard it, and forgot for half a heartbeat that it was a lake. The lake was, for that half heartbeat, a great quiet animal lying very still on its belly. The sound, the mountains of the highlands heard it, and felt themselves a touch flatter for the hearing. The sound, the stars over the Hebrides, the few left in the late dawn, paused in the small fond way stars pause when they are being addressed. The light arrived at Voldemort. It arrived at Voldemort in the way a tide arrives at a sandcastle. It arrived without spite. It arrived without effort. It arrived in the small, kindly manner of a thing arriving at a place where it had business, and dissolved the small, standing shape of him with the slow inevitability of bath water dissolving a sugar cube. The body of Lord Voldemort, which Pettigrew had labored to construct from bone and flesh and blood, the body that had cost a hand and a year and 3 lives that had not, in any of the histories, been recorded properly, the body came apart in the manner of a dropped vase. It came apart politely. It came apart not in fragments but in segments, in the careful order one disassembles a thing when one has been asked. The robe fell. The pale arms ended their being. The chest ceased to be a chest. The 2 slits of the nose finally became the no-nose they had always wanted to be, and then ceased to be a nose at all. The eyes, for they were after all eyes, looked, for a small final fraction of an instant, surprised. The wraith inside the body, the part of Voldemort that had been, since Halloween 1981, a creature without a place, was, the same moment, undone. The Horcruxes in the places they had hidden in for a generation, the locket in a damp cave on the coast, the diadem in a forgotten chamber in the castle behind Harry, the cup in a vault in London, the ring in a derelict hovel on a hill, went each one with a small sound in unison. The diadem in the room of requirement in particular made the long sigh of a thing that had been bored for a long time. The Death Eaters in their 3 lines did not particularly fall. The light did not particularly want them. The light, the way the master had once not punched a friend who had been doing him wrong, declined to need them. The light moved through them, through Bellatrix, through Lucius, through Dolohov, who had been about to mutter another mutter, and who, in the small space of being moved through, lost the next mutter and the one after that. The Death Eaters stood in the light, and the light considered them, and the light decided about them. It decided in the small, efficient way the master decided about onions in a grocery aisle that they were not particularly the point. The light went out. The world the next second was the world again. There was a long quiet over the lawn. Bellatrix on the grass sat down. She had not in many years sat down on grass. She sat. Her wand was in her hand. She looked at her wand. She looked at the place on the grass where Voldemort had been. She looked at her wand again. "Oh," she said. Lucius, beside her, took in the manner of a man rebuilding a posture a breath. He adjusted his cuff. He looked at Harry. He looked, in passing, at Bellatrix. He looked at Bellatrix again. He set very carefully his cane down on the grass. Dolohov on the other side of him sat as well. He muttered a small mutter. The mutter was about lunch. It would be one of his last political mutters of any seriousness, and the mutter remained in his own private head for the rest of his life, an embarrassment. Greyback, who had been drooling, was no longer drooling. Greyback, in fact, would never, for the rest of his life, particularly want to bite anything again. He was not, the next morning, sure why. He was glad of it. Harry put the chopstick wand back in his pocket. He looked at the empty patch of grass where Voldemort had been. He looked at the Death Eaters who were in their 3 lines, no longer in 3 lines, but in a small confused shape on the ground. He nodded very slightly to no one. "Yeah," he said mildly. In the small, disordered pause that followed, the front gates of Hogwarts, which had been closed and reinforced and braced for the morning, opened, gently, on their own initiative. A bald man in a yellow tracksuit and slippers walked up the path. He had in one hand a flyer. The flyer was creased. He looked in passing at the Death Eaters on the lawn. He did not particularly register them. He arrived at Harry. He patted Harry on the shoulder. He held up the flyer. "You seen the sale flyer for Ollivanders," he said. "They got it half off. I figured you might need a new wand sometime." Harry looked at the flyer. He looked at the chopstick wand in his pocket. He had at 14 not quite outgrown the chopstick. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe, thanks, cool." The master looked briefly at Geno's, who had in the long second of the light not moved and who was now slowly lowering his metal hands. "Hey Geno's, master, you been eating?" "Yes, master." "Good." The master, with the small, slow movement of a man who has had a long morning, sat down on the grass. He took the flyer back. He smoothed it on his knee. He read it. He turned a page. He read another. He did not particularly look up. He whistled very faintly off-key. On the steps of the castle, behind Harry, Albus Dumbledore, sat down. He sat where he was, on the stone, very slowly, in the careful way a tall old man sits when the tall old man is tired. He folded his hands over the head of his wand. He bowed his head over his hands. He did not particularly speak. McGonagall beside him looked at the lawn. She looked at the Death Eaters. She looked at Harry. She looked at the bald man on the grass with the flyer. "Albus, Minerva, is it over?" "Yes, all of it, yes." She stood for a long second. Then she said in a voice the kind teachers save for their last classes of the year, I shall need a cup of tea." "Yes." A very large cup of tea." "Yes, Minerva." Aurors arrived on apparition, 3 at a time in the next minute. They began with the systematic absent precision of Aurors to collect the Death Eaters who did not particularly resist. Bellatrix went without comment. Lucius went without his cane. Dolohov muttered. Harry on the lawn turned. He walked back up to the steps. The 4-legged thing by his ankle paced one circle around him and stayed. Hermione, at the front of the line on the steps, watched him come. She did not particularly run forward. She stood. She had at 14 learned by now the polite small art of letting Harry come to her at his own pace. Harry arrived at the steps. Harry stopped at the bottom step. Harry looked up at her. She looked back. Her hand on the wand had relaxed. She said in a voice she did not particularly raise, "Harry, yeah, that was in fact one spell. Yeah, and you cast it the way you do every spell, just politely." "Yeah, right," she nodded. She did the small, almost imperceptible thing that in Hermione was a smile. She set her wand down on the stone beside her. She came down the steps. She took Harry's hand the way she had taken it once after a troll in 1991 and held it for a count of 3 and let it go. "All right," she said. Right. She went after that away from him for a few seconds because she had a list to add to in her head, and she did not particularly want to do the listing where he could see her doing it. Ron came down the steps next. Ron, who had been with Harry for 4 years, said, "Blimey." He punched Harry gently on the shoulder. Ron did not weep. He very nearly did. He bit his lip in the small Weasley way of the Weasley boys and shook his head and grinned the great open grin of a tall boy whose best friend had not, in the end, died on a Tuesday. Cedric came down third. Cedric stopped 2 steps above Harry. Cedric looked at him in the polite older brother manner that by now was practiced. "Quidditch," said Cedric. "What? Hufflepuff versus everybody else. Saturday, get a team." "Cedric, I'm not negotiating." "Cedric, you just nothing, get a team. Saturday we play." Harry, in spite of himself, laughed. The laugh was a small good laugh. The laugh was the small good laugh the master had been waiting 4 years to hear, although he would not particularly mention it. On the grass behind them, the bald man with the flyer on his knee said mildly, "You guys eaten?" Up at the castle's high window, in the small office that overlooked the lawn, the portraits of the previous headmistresses and headmasters watched the small, disordered party of children make their slow, careful way back into the castle, with the bald man at the back and the 4-legged silver thing pacing alongside. Phineas Nigellus, the most cynical of the portraits, did not say a thing. Diles Derwent, the most observant, said after a long pause, "Well, indeed," said Everard after his own pause. "Indeed," said Phineas finally. who was a man not given to indeed. In the small upstairs window the headmaster's office watched. The curtain, which had not in any history moved on its own, moved on its own. The curtain pulled itself back a quarter of an inch. It pulled itself back another quarter. It said, in the way curtains said it, fine. Down in the noodle place in Z-City, in the small late afternoon of the same day, the woman with the one earring, who was wiping the counter, paused, looked up, and looked out of the window at the small empty patch of sky over Z-City for a long minute. Her son, 10, asked her what she was looking at. She said nothing for a while. Then she said very quietly, "Good morning," somewhere, and went back to wiping the counter. On a lawn in Scotland, the master, who would in time be told by Genos with several adjustments the full account of what Harry had done, looked up from his flyer. He looked at Harry, halfway up the steps of the castle, who was, in spite of himself, laughing at something Ron had said. The master, who had built over 4 years the small unimpressive habit of finding small unimpressive boys in small wet places and giving them tea, turned, very slightly, the corner of his mouth. "Cool," he said, to no one in particular. He went back to the flyer. The flyer said, "Onions half off." The morning, in spite of everything, was still young.